In any case, what I really see happening is great teams like Celsius being able to utilize various DeFi protocols on various chains to give your users access to that yield, which really benefits everybody. It benefits the users because the users have access to those protocols and their benefits. It benefits Celsius because Celsius can do that in a secure and reliable way with the help of decentralized Oracle networks and various other systems. And it also benefits the DeFi protocols because they get more access to a user base, right? They get more access to value locked. They basically become more used, which is always their express goal. The way I see Chainlink cross-chain services playing into this is very clear. I think there's these critical nuances around first moving the assets in some kind of really secure, non-custodial way into these various environments so that they can actually be placed into the DeFi protocols, once again, in a way that creates a lot of assurance to Celsius and its users with a lot of transparency, which is exactly what decentralized Oracle networks expressly seek to do, and to do that in a very secure way. And then the second one is eventually actually creating the messages and the commands through a Chainlink cross-chain system that actually utilizes those DeFi protocols. So I think there's this fascinating world where not only can you move value into these other protocols through Chainlink cross-chain messaging and bridging and smart bridging capabilities and systems, but you can actually tell the Chainlink programmable bridge that, hey, I'm going to give you this many tokens, and I want you to actually enact this usage of a protocol over there. And so the bridge now becomes kind of an agent, a highly transparent, highly reliable agent that's in the control of Celsius and its smart contracts and its systems. But all of that is, once again, super transparent, right? So the user can know that they've been able to use 5 different DeFi protocols on 5 different chains for the purposes of getting access to the benefit of all those protocols. They've been able to do that through Celsius, but they have a transparent cross-chain infrastructure that allows not only the movement of value, but also the ability to direct that value in a very reliable way. And so I think supercharging both the rate at which value can be moved into these various chains for the use of these other protocols for the benefit of users, and the ability to also send messages is in combination going to be really, really powerful, because it's just going to accelerate the rate at which you can make something called cross-chain dApps or cross-chain kind of financial applications. And that's really what I see Celsius really seeing the benefit of and getting behind. It's really making a number of cross-chain applications that get its users a multitude of different benefits from different chains, whatever the great new DeFi product on whatever chain is with like 20% yield, Celsius users should be able to get access to that through an efficient, secure, and highly transparent cross-chain system. And that's really, I think, the great partnership that we formed here.
Right, and to add to that, the innovation used to be living only on one chain, which it all starts on Ethereum, and it lived there. But now, like you said, there are many chains, and they're all starving for that liquidity, right? A lot, even if they have yield, in many cases, they need that liquidity to be able to really scale and operate at optimal efficiency, or be able to create that yield and optimal efficiency. So part of these bridges is also enabling liquidity to flow cross-chain to where it's needed the most, and which was not really possible before. It required many manual steps that took time and did not allow this liquidity to really flow efficiently. The vast majority of this value creation is then captured by the community through their participation, or through them providing this liquidity through platforms like Celsius.
Yeah. I think eventually we'll arrive at some place where you might even have vertically focused chains or geographically focused chains, and there, in my opinion, will be a very large degree of smart contract execution on Ethereum, including for DeFi. I think the interesting thing is allowing people to build basically cross-chain applications that use both Ethereum and whatever other benefits other chains have, whether that's getting something about supply chain data and combining that with DeFi and combining that with carbon credits on another chain, and kind of just building more and more advanced cross-chain applications. I do think that the core logic of certain smart contracts might still keep living in one primary chain. I don't know exactly how that's going to evolve, but right now that still looks heavily like it's Ethereum at the moment. Generally speaking, I'm super excited about enabling CeFi and DeFi to benefit from all the great work happening on various environments. And I think that the approach Celsius is taking, both by becoming more decentralized over time, providing these cryptographic proofs to users, and by generating all of this proof in your cross-chain movements. And it's amazing to me that there's going to be 16 billion, or probably by the time we're really getting this live, probably much more, being able to be sent to use various DeFi protocols and various smart contracts on various chains. I think that's going to be a really amazing picture of how really the blockchain world should operate, right? Is that you should actually be able to access data, you should be able to access the resources of other chains, you should be able to access all of these kind of capabilities and efficiently combine them into a single, highly reliable, multi-chain, externally data-powered kind of decentralized application of some kind, even if it has certain multi-sig or private key components that are more centralized, right? So at the end of the day, I think you're going to be arriving at a more advanced application in terms of the model that you guys are building in.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think a lot of these other blockchains have built EVM compatibility because they wanted to effectively suck in the users or the devs or the liquidity. But I see that as a two-way highway in which many participants want to go back and forth. And like you said, it's very important to build this as a two-way platform that enables both users and developers and liquidity to flow in all directions, because that's what the competition is not between this chain and that chain. The competition is between traditional finance and this new decentralized form where innovation is happening at 100 times faster pace than traditional finance. And really, for all of us to work together to build these bridges is creating the future of finance, is making a much more reliable, a much more sustainable ecosystem. And again, I come from a telecom world where we had global standards for the last 100 years or so, right? I worked before Celsius. I helped launch the first 5G device here in the United States with Verizon, the MiFi 1000, and that's a global standard, right? Even though we used components and pieces from maybe 100 different suppliers, it all came together and it worked because of these standards. And that's what we need to do here as well. We need to make sure that everybody works on a standard that the community can benefit from.
Completely agree. I think you just said it very, very well, that we're all just working on this together. And I think you and me have always really viewed this as growing the entire pie of our entire industry. And I think that'll result in much more value being secured on Ethereum and in various other places. And I think the real value of all this is just growing the usefulness of DeFi and blockchains for the larger financial ecosystem through all the unique benefits that it has. So I'm thrilled that we're working on this together, and I really appreciate your thoughtful feedback on all this. Alex, as usual, I'm thrilled that we're building a more decentralized, more transparent world together. Thank you so much for speaking with me here at the conference. I really appreciate it. As always, I'm thrilled that we're working together and looking forward to speaking again sometime soon. Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks for having me back, and looking forward to next year's conference.
Thank you so much, Alex and Sergey. Appreciate those words. coming off of Sergey's keynote to talk about Celsius and the recent integration and building the future of decentralized services together. One of the things Sergey mentioned in his keynote was keepers are now live, Chainlink keepers. So for our next panel, we've got a group of Chainlink users who are here to talk about some of the use cases for keepers. So for this next panel, I'm going to introduce Anush Vijayaraghavan from Chainlink Labs team. He's a new addition for many of you in the community, and I'll throw it over to Anush, who will then bring on our panel.
Perfect. Thank you, Andy. Perfect. Thank you for that, Andy. Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Anush Vijayaraghavan from Chainlink Labs, and I'm happy to be here today to moderate this panel on automation infrastructure and the use cases of Chainlink keepers. We have an excellent group of panelists here to talk about reliable automation, how automation is evolving as the blockchain ecosystem grows and becomes more sophisticated, and where Chainlink keepers fits into this picture. Smart contracts allow for a highly trustworthy collaboration across even distrusting parties, establishing and maintaining truth that we can all agree to. But there are limitations. They cannot communicate with the outside world on their own, a problem that's addressed through decentralized Oracle networks, and they require external input for actions to be taken, oftentimes cascading down from a user clicking a button somewhere on a UI. However, not all actions can be driven by immediate end user input. So we need to create these off-chain application layers and infrastructure layers to set on top of your smart contracts. So your dApps can be automated based on time, events, some combination of the two, perhaps some off-chain computation, rather than being solely driven by direct human interaction. Now, creating and maintaining this automation infrastructure is critical to the core function of many dApps. And today we will discuss the pitfalls and the opportunities that automation infrastructure presents and how to safely and reliably outsource this fundamental automation work. On our panel today, we have Kane Warwick, the founder of Synthetics, Max Figa from the core team at Barnbridge, Ernesto Boado, the CTO of Aave, Brendan Asselstein, the CTO of PullTogether, and Peter Van Morik, the CEO of Chainlayer. We have a lot to get through today, so I'll just jump right into it. As a starting point, it might be useful for the audience to hear a bit about your project and the role of automation in your work. Kane, would you like to kick us off with this?
Sure. So, for those of you who don't know, Synthetics allows you to get exposure to a range of different assets on Ethereum. It's a fairly complex smart contract suite, and we were lucky to work with Chainlink early to implement their oracles to support the network. But over the intervening 2 years, I think it's been now since we've been live, we've added a lot of new functionality, and there's a lot of aspects of the system that require intervention. And so we have a number of aspects of the protocol that on a weekly basis, some bot or some keeper needs to come in and make a transaction based on some information that's on the blockchain, and it's just not possible to kind of automate those things with simple payments. So we've been talking to Chainlink about taking over a lot of that infrastructure as they do with our oracles, because we want a streamlined and simple interface for all of these different aspects of the system that need to be maintained.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Kane. Ernesto, would you like to cover Aave?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. For those who don't know what Aave is a liquidity protocol where people can supply assets to get yield on them or borrow them. And in general, it's a pretty a standalone running protocol, let's say, in the sense that it doesn't need so much automation, at least in multiple points. But there are certain aspects, like for example the liquidations, where actually automation can improve the system by orders of magnitude. So another point is also like in certain parts where the computation are quite heavy, and potentially it could be re-architected to introduce other parties that do some kind of automation to optimize the cost. So yeah. Pretty excited to see how it's going to look the ecosystem like in the future with intervention of keepers.
Perfect. Thank you, Ernesto. Peter?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Chainlayer is a node operator on the Chainlink network. We're also a staking service provider on a lot of networks, and I think Keeper for us enables us to do a whole lot of automation on things we now run in various crowns, various systems, and especially the security aspect of it is amazing. If you run a script that has to do something on chain, you basically need a private key somewhere, or you need to secure it with ledgers or difficult things. And with Keeper, that whole part of security is basically outsourced to the node operators. We like to dog food Chainlink as node operators, and this is a perfect example of things we can do ourselves. So yeah, really excited.
Thank you, Peter. Brendan, would you like to go next?
Yeah. Thanks, Anush. So I'm Brendan from Pool Together, and Pool Together is a prize savings game. So users deposit into a prize pool, interest accrues, and that interest is awarded as a prize. And so the prizes are awarded periodically. We use Chainlink for two things. One, the Chainlink VRF to get a random number to select the winner or multiple winners. And two, we need that reward triggered periodically. And in fact, it can be triggered by anyone. But as Peter said, we effectively need a cron job to run it. But what we can do now is have the protocol cover the cost of rewarding the transactions, because of course that needs to be paid for, and have it managed all by the Chainlink keepers. So it's a really effective system for us to be able to outsource that, which we try to do as much as possible. We don't want to run servers.
Understandable. Max, would you like to go next?
Sure. So Barnbridge is a risk tokenization protocol, meaning that we build applications that go after specific risks users in DeFi are trying to alleviate or get more exposure to. We rely on Chainlink keepers primarily for our smart exposure application, which allows anyone to create a pool between any two assets, any ratio they'd like, that will constantly rebalance kind of around the parameters of that pool. So that might be 5% deviation from the ratio between the two assets on a daily basis. And when that deviation is triggered, a Chainlink keeper can actually trigger the swap necessary to bring things back to parity with the kind of established ratio of a given pool.
Thank you, Max. So thank you all for introducing your company and how you're using Chainlink, as well as where you might see automation having an impact on your work. I think it'll be good for us to maybe dig a little bit deeper into how what considerations really go into the process of deciding how you do automation. The criticality of automation is clear in order to create more and more sophisticated dApps over time. But there are a number of difficulties to consider. There's DevOps maintenance concerns. There are centralized automation risks. There's economic incentive considerations. And maximizing decentralization is also critical as part of this. Perhaps you could share what are some of the complexities that you've found in your experience, and perhaps some pain points as well. I'd like to open this up to the entire panel and see where we go from there.
Well, I'm happy to start.
Excellent,
yeah.
Thank you.
I can kick it off. Yeah, So we've been using Chainlink VRF now for a good while now. In fact, probably over a year and a half or so. And an important consideration has been support, has been the ability to reach out to somebody if something goes wrong to get things in order again. And so that was a big consideration when looking at Chainlink keepers, is that there's accountability. And it's difficult to have that in all decentralized systems. I mean, if something happens on Ropsten, who do you talk to? Who do you reach out to? Do you just tweet it out and hope for the best, and see if someone picks it up? So that accountability is really important. And just because, in these kind of external systems, like, Oracle networks, essentially, if we include keepers as part of that kind of, then things are going to go wrong. There are going to be problems. It's inevitable. And so having a support system has been really, really valuable to us. So that's been the primary consideration. Secondary, as I already mentioned, we don't want to run servers. Our goal is to become a pure decentralized protocol. So we want to stick to our core value add, which is writing great smart contracts. And so being able to delegate that for a pretty minimal premium is really valuable to us. We want to make sure that it's done well by a professional community.
Thank you, Brandon. Kane, I think
I can jump in.
Synthetics has some very interesting scenarios to consider here. So yes, please.
Yeah, I think one thing I will say, if you're on Ropsten in 2021, you're probably NGMI, unfortunately. Sorry, Ropsten Maxis, but I think it's game over there. So I think with Synthetics, we've got a range of different things, right? And a range of considerations in terms of like incentivization, economic incentives. There's a whole range of considerations that we had. And what we ended up with over the course of multiple years was like this patchwork of different systems with different incentives, and they were incompatible, and sometimes things wouldn't work, and actions wouldn't be triggered, and it was just a bit of a mess. And so we actually started working originally with Andre when he started developing Keeper, and we talked to him. But I think one of the primary considerations that was kind of not met for me, at least in that architecture, was this idea of taking the kind of auction process offline. So having some kind of mechanism to ensure that you weren't having these gas wars. So because we saw this a lot in the early days when we had Keepers, even for simple things like closing a fee period. It got to a point where there were multiple different bots that were competing for it. And then over time, all of the less successful bots just dropped off to the point where there was only one, and then that one would fall over and then nothing would happen. And so we saw this play out. We saw this, kind of iterative game play out where like one person would take all of the spoils, and then eventually, something would go wrong and there was no decentralization, and it didn't work. And so it was really important to us that the architecture that we chose had this, component of some kind of off-chain system to ensure that you didn't have perverse economic incentives. So when Chainlink started working with Andre and all of this research started happening, and we started talking to you guys and going a bit deeper, that to me was like the primary consideration, that this was like this off-chain network. The economic incentives were aligned. You had confidence that you weren't going to have this winner-take-all effect, and then a very brittle system emerging over time. So you could kind of implement it and not worry about it, and go away and assume that it was still going to be there in 6 months' time, and not be constantly monitoring to see what the state of it was.
Right. It's kind of this situation where it's game theory 101. You need to make sure that there's cooperation between all the keepers so that everyone is profitable in general, and not have just a Wild West competition between all the different parties involved. Thank you for that, Kane. Max or Nessa, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I can take that. I think what I find more interesting is like the implications that it has in architecture of new systems. Like personally, I suppose everybody else that has experience on smart contracts in the code knows that when you have a system that is too reliable on parties that needs to trigger something, usually the system, initially at least, seems a bit more fragile, because you need to have a good system of incentivization, you need to have good infra, because usually you need to check some conditions of chain to then trigger that action on chain. So we just try to avoid it as much as possible. But obviously, in a lot of cases, it's not possible to avoid it. So having something like Keeper, and we already also experimented with Andre back in the days for the liquidations, on the previous system of Keeper, but having a system that is reliable in terms of infra and incentives, and systems like the Aave protocol that is basically running out there and decentralized, doesn't really need to care that works well. I think it's a huge advantage even for future design of systems, where you can actually think, okay, maybe it's fine to have some scheduled tasks on the design, because at least there is a reliable system out there that could cover them. So.
Right. Those are definitely some of the themes we've consistently seen when doing some of the user research on what are our users looking for from an automation infrastructure. But reliability is always coming up as like the number one in general. And that is represented in a number of different ways. And then the second thing we've been hearing a lot about is around ease of use. And a third and very critical component that we've seen from a segment of the marketplace seems to be around being able to do some of this computation off-chain, so that you don't have as much excess gas costs. If doing everything on chain is extremely expensive, reads are expensive over time. And so that's come up quite a bit in our discussions as well. Max, would you have any thoughts as to like how off-chain computation as part of a infrastructure model to trigger actions might benefit BarnBridge?
Sure. So when you think about the types of assumptions we make in DeFi today around risk management, right? It can be, you have to take into consideration what you can do on chain, and that's quite limited. Whereas, when we look at incumbents in legacy finance, they're running risk algorithms day and night to manage their systems, right? And so when we think about where does DeFi head over the next 2-3 years, I think off-chain computation, kind of referencing back to smart contracts and being able to impact the parameters we're operating under in those smart contracts is going to be very critical. And something I'd add just kind of on the last question line, right? Along with that expansion of DeFi and this expansion of complexity, I think there's definitely something to be said for specialized services like keeper networks, right? Because if you imagine a new project launching today, maybe they're DAO first, maybe they're not, but it's going to become increasingly difficult to consider all of these other chains that might be a constellation around Ethereum. And how do you accommodate your apps across multiple ones, right? Do you have your own bots on every single network that may or may not be relevant to your apps, right? And so this idea that like having a keeper network allows you as a new team to kind of have this infrastructure kind of, again, in your sails, so to speak, as you're examining the wider landscape, I think is also really critical.
Agreed. And Peter, from Chainlayer's perspective, you guys are involved in being a fundamental infrastructure to the blockchain ecosystem. And I'm kind of curious, like from your perspective, how do you see long-term where automation can really help perhaps reduce some of the burden on your teams?
I think on our side, there's a lot of things we need to do on networks, like redelegate rewards, withdraw commissions, maybe even activate validators in some cases. And basically with Keeper, you can automate any on-chain thing, and especially with CCIP just being announced. For us, this I mean, this basically
lots of things coming together.
Yeah, this really opens endless opportunities for us to automate not just the infrastructure, because unfortunately we do need infrastructure to run our organization. And we like to automate infrastructure as much as possible, but the on-chain part is always something that's really hard to automate. To be honest, today I'm not really sure where we're going to end up in a year, but yeah, the possibilities are endless, basically. But I think we're really excited about facilitating other users with their goals. I think for us as an infrastructure company, we live because other people rely on our expertise regarding security and keeping things up. And this is just another perfect example of an opportunity where we as Chainlayer, and I think all node operators, are really going to be excited to be a part of automating more things on the side of our customers.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. And that kind of brings us to a future-looking concern. And obviously, it's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen, but blockchain is often seen as this democratizing foundation for the world to form trusted bonds without having to place the trust purely in brands, individual promises, or relying on institutions for adjudication purposes. So I'm personally very curious about how the ecosystem reacts to having an incredibly easy to integrate automation infrastructure at their fingertips. What will emerge next? If we look at how the ecosystem has been evolving over time, we've seen changes at an astounding rate. What DeFi is today was a dream 2 years ago, and that was broadly enabled by obtaining high-quality price and market data on-chain. So in a more future-looking perspective, what do you see as the potential changes we'll see as the ecosystem matures and automation infrastructure becomes a lot more easily accessible, so any dApp developer can make use of it in a matter of minutes? Brendan, would you like to jump in on this one, or Ernesto?
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in. It's a very broad question.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I do want to make a quick comment though, because your last question was a really good one. In that we have direct, and the question was how useful will it be to move that computation off chain? And with the current Keeper design, you do first the check to see what needs to be done, and then the work, the actual transaction. Our code for those two are almost identical, and the check can be done entirely off chain because it is the actual execution that does the verification of what, you know, it only can run a valid transaction. And so moving that off chain will be super critical. And we've been doing that more and more. In fact, Pool Together V4, we're moving a lot of computation off chain. So it just becomes verification in that sense. So I do see a lot of potential for growth there. In terms of unlocking developer capabilities, I mean, the more these pieces become Lego pieces, the more innovation we're going to see at hackathons and elsewhere. The more permissionless this is to get involved. You know, if registering a keeper becomes as simple as just like pushing a button, we're going to see some awesome innovation happen at these hackathons. That's where Pool Together started. That's where a lot of projects get started. When you bring people together and just give them the tools to be able to build whatever they want to build. So as this system becomes more permissionless, I think innovation will only grow exponentially.
Agree. Yeah, I kind of agree with Brendan on both points. Like moving off-chain computation is completely necessary. Like we are seeing it now with 4x4, like the gas consumption of the smart contracts that are deployed, like it tends to go up all the time. So it's important that new tools appear that they offload that. And then that unlocking the developers is, I think, is where I'm more bullish on this kind of systems, because end of the day, even if in Ethereum sometimes like the constraints on development is actually what brings a bit of innovation, I don't think it's really optimal. So probably that is the solution, like having at least a minimal assumption that you could automate something on chain or with this hybrid system. Also, I would say that the bridging capabilities and like playing with cross-chain communication with these keepers is something which I'm pretty bullish on. So, but probably it will be a bit more in the line. So,
absolutely. I mean, connecting all these different tooling together to create a more sophisticated hybrid DApp, hybrid smart contracts, is definitely the future. Kane, would you have anything to add to that?
I think Ernesto's point earlier was pretty indicative of kind of the place that we're at, right? A few questions ago, he kind of made the point that like, oh, we try and avoid this as much as possible, right? Like we try not to have any automation. That's kind of the default assumption for people, at the moment. It's like anything that, even looks like it requires a keeper or whatever, like let's work out a system that might be more complex or convoluted that can avoid that. And so I think that once we get to a level of comfort in the ecosystem that this is a thing and it works and it's stable, it's the same thing as, I see keepers as kind of like a subset of the Oracle problem, right? Like it's just a specific, implementation of the Oracle problem. And I think when we saw Chainlink oracles get to a point where the DeFi ecosystem was comfortable using them, and remember that always wasn't the case, right? Like, a lot of people were running their own oracles. The effort of running your own oracles or your own keepers is significant. And so you couldn't just turn up at a hackathon and be like, oh, let me just spin up my own oracle today, and then that will allow me to do whatever I want to do in this hackathon, right? So like these are really enabling technologies. And I think that we're probably not there yet in terms of like getting everyone a level of comfort that, these are ready for production, but I think it's close. And once it gets to that point, then, it sort of goes parabolic.
Definitely. It does feel like we're very much at that starting point of getting the kind of tooling necessary for developers to really be able to create highly sophisticated apps with just one or two people in a garage. As Brendan was saying, a lot of these projects start off from a small group getting together to make something very interesting. So we have DeFi now. We have a whole bunch of new business verticals that can start being enabled by blockchain technology. And having these small groups come together to really create this next generation is, I think, where we're hopefully going to see a lot more of the market go. Max, is there anything you wanted to add to that from a Barnbridge's perspective?
No, I think everything was covered quite well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So that's pretty close to about the amount of time we have for this panel. So I'd like to close out by thanking all the panelists for being here today. And for those of you watching online, Our goal in creating Chainlink Keepers was to provide this easy-to-use, reliable automation infrastructure for the blockchain ecosystem and the developer community at large. Any dApp developer looking to automate their smart contract can integrate Chainlink Keepers without worrying about deep integration concerns, and can do so in a matter of minutes to hours. Making your contracts Keeper compatible, all it requires is your Solidity code and a simple registration process with our Chainlink Keepers app. Chainlink Keepers network is created to create a fundamental fair playing field where keepers must cooperate with one another and not compete. Head over to our website, read our latest blog post, and check out our documentation. We are now live on mainnet, and we'd love to have you using their product. I hope this was engaging and informative, and I hope you enjoy the rest of SmartCon. Thank you.
Thanks, Anush.
Thanks, Anush.
Thank you, everyone, to the whole panel. And Anush, I hope you guys enjoyed meeting Anush as well, Chainlink Labs team member. I really appreciate you guys' insights there. If you have questions, if you're a developer and you've got questions about integrating keepers or co-marketing or whatever it is that you want to work with Chainlink Labs, head down to the Expo section and talk to our Chainlink experts. There's a tab there. You can go and talk to some of the reps that are there ready to talk to you. But up next, we've got another Chainlink Labs team member, Chief Scientist of Chainlink Labs, Ari Jules.
I'm going to talk today about fair sequencing services, a platform we're developing as a product at Chainlink Labs. As the name suggests, the goal of the system is to order transactions in a way that is fair, beneficial for users. Before I get into details, let me provide a little background. How are transactions ordered today? The transactions, of course, are submitted by users to a mempool and then taken up by miners. When a miner successfully mines a block, it includes transactions in it. And an important thing to know is that the miner gets to determine how the transactions are ordered in the block. And it does this unilaterally. What this means is that existing systems are centralized in this temporary and limited way, but nonetheless, they are at least partially centralized. Well, so what? So these decentralized systems have a touch of centralization in them. Why does this matter? It's not as though miners, for instance, can tamper with transactions. Well, it turns out that the order of transactions, the ordering of transactions matters a lot. And let me explain this by way of example. Suppose that Alice wants to buy a token on an exchange, say an automated market maker. For example, she'd like to buy some Bob's Bubble token, or BBT, for ETH. She submits a transaction to the mempool, and that works its way on chain, and she obtains some quantity of BBT. So for instance, she may obtain a price of 1 ETH per BBT. And if the AMM parameters are right, her transaction will cause the price of BBT to rise. Well, this is all well and good. But when Alice submits her transaction to the mempool, it's of course observed by all miners. And it's known, of course, to the miner that mines her transaction. This miner can take advantage of this knowledge and its ability to order transactions to do the following. It can create 2 transactions, a buy transaction and a sell transaction, and order its buy transaction before Alice's and its sell transaction afterwards. This is what's known as a sandwiching attack. What's the effect of this? Well, the miner's buy transaction will do exactly what Alice's transaction accomplished originally. It's to say the miner will get 1,000 BBT, as Alice would have if the miner were not present, and the price of BBT will rise. Now, Alice's transaction gets processed, and she gets some BBT, but the price of BBT has risen, so she gets a little less BBT than she would have otherwise. Her transaction also causes the price of BBT to rise. Now, the miner turns around and sells the tokens that it acquired. And it makes a profit because Alice has helpfully caused the price of BBT to rise between the 2 transactions submitted by the miner. What's the effect of all of this? Well, Alice is getting fewer tokens in this toy example, 25 fewer tokens than she would have gotten otherwise. And the miner's making a profit. The miner sold his tokens for 1025 ETH, but only paid 1,000. Where's the miner's profit coming from? Out of Alice's pocket, of course. The value exploited by the miner here, extracted from the user, has come to be known to the community as MEV, or miner extractable value. And this is a term coined in a paper that my academic group published, led by Phil Diane, back in 2019. Now, there are many forms of MEV, and loosely speaking, some are good and some are bad. For example, certain forms of arbitrage are useful in that they communicate price information across markets, across contracts, across chains, or whatever. But things like sandwich attacks and related attacks like front running, which Sandwich Attacks Incorporated, are for the most part clearly bad. And they're not a hypothetical concern. They happen today all the time. Miners are doing exactly what I described in conjunction with arbitrageurs. In our paper 2 years ago, we included examples of the plaintive cries of users who had lost money, in that case to bots, but equivalently today, potentially to miners. And some of these are really disturbing. I'm a stay-at-home parent. I day trade to keep my family above water, but this was a mistaken order. Please send my money back. I have faith in you. This was an accident. I'm a single parent, and so on and so forth. And there's a litany of these online. Perhaps the most disturbing was this one from Rajesh, who gathered up rupee in his village and rolled the dice on a transaction in DEX and was front run by a bot at that time and lost all the money. And one shudders to think what happened to this poor fellow. So, as I said, this is not a hypothetical concern. What can we do about it? We probably can't eliminate all bad MEV, all exploitation of users of this kind, but we can at least build tools that help mitigate the problem by enacting policies for users that are fairer in the sense of reducing the opportunities for miners to take advantage of the ability to order transactions. And this is the goal of fair sequencing services. Just a reminder, in the current model of transaction ordering, it's the miner that decides unilaterally how transactions get ordered. In FSS, the goal is to replace this miner with a collection of nodes, with a set of entities, in particular a decentralized committee to determine how transactions get ordered. And this ordering happens off-chain. Natural question to ask is, where are we going to get this committee? Where are these nodes going to come from? Well, it turns out that decentralized Oracle networks are actually great ready-made committees. They provide the trustworthiness that is required for this operation. And also, as it turns out, reporting on observed transaction ordering transactions is a very natural Oracle functionality. After all, what do oracles do? They observe off-chain behavior or activity. They reach consensus on their observation, and they report their observation on chain. And that's exactly what FSS is doing. We plan to deploy FSS in 2 phases. In the first phase, we're going to implement what's known as secure causal ordering, or more formally, secure causal atomic broadcast. The intuition here is that this type of ordering involves no node seeing the payload of a transaction, the actual substance of a transaction, before the transaction is ordered. And this idea is actually decades old. Dates originally to, I think, the PhD thesis of Mike Reiter back in the 90s. How do we accomplish this? Well, very simply using encryption. So here's the idea. Transactions are submitted to the committee in encrypted form. They're encrypted under the public key of the committee. The corresponding private key is secret shared among nodes in the committee. The committee then decides how to order these transactions and decides collectively on definitive ordering of those transactions before it decrypts them. The committee performs a threshold decryption once the transaction ordering has been decided upon. This is great because it's hard to front run or otherwise attack transactions you can't see. And by the time the transactions are revealed, it's too late to squeeze in additional transactions. So even a rogue committee member doesn't have the power to extract MEV from users. It works very well, but it has a couple of limitations. The first is that metadata are not encrypted. For example, you can't encrypt the address from which a transaction has been sent. And metadata can convey enough information for an adversary to extract value from users and to mount attacks roughly like the type that I described. The other thing it doesn't protect against is what I call blind front running. So suppose, for example, there's an ICO and one node in the committee or some other adversary wants to be the first to buy tokens in that ICO. Well, there's nothing in the properties of secure causal ordering that prevent the adversary from squeezing transactions in at the front of a block before other users' transactions. So these two limitations of secure causal ordering suggest that it doesn't give us everything we're looking for. Note, interestingly, that secure causal ordering doesn't actually specify the ordering of transactions. It merely says that they need to be ordered before they're decrypted, but it doesn't tell you how they should be ordered. And this observation is the springboard for the second phase of development we're planning, namely the addition of the Iquitos family of protocols. Iquitos is a set of transaction ordering protocols, actually consensus protocols with ordering, developed within my academic group in work spearheaded by Mahimna Kelkar. And the intuition here is that transactions get ordered according to the time that they're received, in particular, the time they're received by a supermajority of nodes. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the idea. That's the intuition. So if we put Iquitos together with the scheme I just described, the secure causal ordering scheme, here's what FSS, or the Fss architecture looks like. Transactions are submitted in encrypted form, and they're ordered by Iquitos, again, roughly according to the time that they're received. Then they get decrypted. By putting these two approaches together, we get some nice properties. Iquitos, in particular, prevents attacks of the type that I described earlier against secure causal ordering. Iquitos prevents metadata-based and attacks and, to some extent, blind front-running. But Iquitos does have a limitation. Right? It's potentially stronger than secure causal ordering. It is in certain network models, but it's sensitive to network adversaries and somewhat complicated to implement. On the other hand, Iquitos, as I said, is in principle, when it's working well, stronger than secure causal ordering. Right? If things go well, Iquitos gives you exactly the type of ordering of transactions you're after. If Iquitos fails, though, by also implementing secure causal ordering, we ensure that there's a strong backstop. So if a network adversary is able to manipulate transaction ordering and bypass the security properties of Iquitos, secure causal ordering still presents a barrier to manipulation of user transactions. FSS can be used in a couple of different settings. It can be used as a pre-processing stage for L1, for example. You can associate particular smart contracts with FSS, or an FSS enable particular smart contracts. Ordering, though, is increasingly taking place off-chain in L2 systems. As with the rise of L2 systems, the power of miners to order transactions is being, the locus of transaction ordering is shifting away from miners to L2 systems like rollups. Well, FSS works equally well for L2 systems. L2 systems include transaction sequencers, and those transaction sequencers can be FSS enabled. That's it for my presentation. If you're interested in learning more, I'd encourage you to have a look at the Chainlink 2.0 white paper at the URL given there, or you can take a look at the 2 academic papers that I mentioned in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jules. Appreciate that presentation. Coming up next, we've got Rich Brown from the Smart Contract Research Forum. Smart Contract Research Forum, or SCRF, is a great place to go to find more research initiatives, and we'll hear all about that from Rich Brown coming up right now.
Welcome to the Intro to SCRF presentation. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the lead at the Smart Contract Research Forum. Previously, I was the head of community at MakerDAO for a few years. I'd like to spend the next few minutes giving you an overview of SCRF's mission, talk about what we do, why it's important, and a bit about how people can get involved if they're interested. To start off, let's talk about what SCRF is. We are a community of researchers, analysts, industry experts, and academics gathered together to pursue our goal of making blockchain research accessible to the entire ecosystem. And just as importantly, to make the blockchain's problems accessible to academia. We do this by maintaining a highly moderated chain and project agnostic forum where civility and intellectual rigor are paramount. On top of this forum, we apply incentives. This is the crypto space. So through intelligent application of financial, reputational, and intellectual incentives, we encourage the type of behavior we think which will help us achieve our mission. A little bit about our origin story. SCRF was born out of a series of conversations I had with Sergey Nazarov, who's my co-founder at SCRF. We had a chat about the nature of community in the blockchain space. We spoke at length about what community means, how it can be applied to a mission, how best to design a community that creates reciprocal relationships of value with the organization that's constructing the mission and the users that are participating with it. Through these discussions, we both discovered that we shared a frustration, and that frustration was at the puzzling divide of between academia and industry in our space. We wanted to know why there was no place for blockchain researchers to seek open, real-time peer review, critique, and collaboration, and by extension, why the technologists in our space and the community leaders didn't have a location where they can go to engage with the people, the academics and researchers who are also thinking deeply about the same issues that we are. So, out of these conversations, the Smart Contract Research Forum was born. Let me dig into our mission a little bit.
Well, I did my PhD in information science at the University of Toronto, and before that, I did enterprise risk management at IBM. I did my postdoc at University of Washington. And these days, my affiliations are pretty broad. I work extensively with the IEEE. In the past, I've done some standard setting work with the ISO. I'm a research affiliate at UC London, and so on and so forth. And I've studied crypto broadly since about 2012. I wrote a nice little green book called Cryptocurrencies and Blockchains with Polity and a number of other articles and whatnot. And that's me, Quinn DuPont. Thank you.
Thank you. And next, please, Ellie Rennie.
Yeah, hi. So I work at RMIT University in the Blockchain Innovation Hub, but I'm also involved with something
an endearing, occasionally inspiring, but ultimately frustrating habit of starting from scratch. And it's not entirely clear to us why that is the case. So in order to solve for this problem, SCRF had to break this problem down a bit and look at them one by one, see if we had some solutions for these things. And so the first problem we thought about was the conversation problem. Social platforms have a noticeable bell curve of utility when they're allowed to develop organically They generally follow a predictable life cycle. Core membership creates value. New participants are drawn to this value that they find there. Culture and norms are eventually overwhelmed by the newcomers. The core membership leaves, and the quality of the discourse eventually diminishes until the rest of the users leave as well. This is not an uncommon pattern. I'm sure you've all experienced it. OGs in the space will remember the rise and fall of Bitcoin talk, which is sort of a textbook example of this issue. The way that we solve for this at Scurf is we have a dedicated team of paid moderators and operations personnel, project managers who have no profit motive. Their profit is derived from the maintenance and the support and the facilitation of this environment, so the forum itself. That means that we have a project that supports the space that's completely chain agnostic, project agnostic, and is mentoring and facilitating this community of users that are here to seek open and constructive peer review, civil critique, conversations with people in their space or in their areas of interest, and collaborating to make crypto better, or blockchain in general. Attention is a scarce resource in our space, particularly on the industry side. We need to move quickly and execute as fast. That doesn't leave a lot of time for introspection. Academia has many problems of its own, but one of the benefits there is that there's a certain luxury for academic rigor and deliberation. There is a synergy between these two groups. Industry needs to bring some of this vibrancy to academia. Academia can provide us with that insight and that intellectual rigor and that leg up onto solving problems that we might be whiteboarding without realizing that the solution exists in somebody's filing cabinet already. So we deal with the attention problem by having a community of researchers and academics that we incubate and mentor and train in the forum of junior analysts and academics and postgrads whose job it is to discover, surface, summarize, and rebroadcast novel, actionable research in the space and bring it to the attention of the rest of the ecosystem. These researchers are supported by senior research associates or research fellows that we draw from academia and from research think tanks and research agencies in the space who provide guidance. These posts that we create are presented in a format that allows developers, founders, and architects to easily understand the applicability of a piece of research without having to dive into the source materials, which can be a significant challenge for just myself. Next problem, discoverability. Information in our space, well, I'm sure in many spaces, but I'm familiar with ours. So information in our space is buried in silos, ivory towers, archives, blogs, private repos behind paywalls, on social medias. Finding research is tough. And if you do find it, it's potentially going to be stuck behind a paywall, or and if you get it out from there, in an inscrutable PDF filled with latex and graphs that are, I'm sure, very, very impressive, but difficult for industry to wade through. This prevents a bit of very significant cognitive overhead that needs to be dealt with. On to the next problem. It's the bias problem. In our space, we are all familiar with a tendency for discourse to find the lowest common denominator, frankly. There's a lot of territorialism in this space. Maximalism runs rampant. Antagonism, shilling, groupthink, all of these things are common, rife with logical and rhetorical fallacies and traps. It's difficult to have a good conversation. And if you do have one, how long it's going to last is anybody's guess. We have a solution for that problem as well. And this is potentially one of our most innovative, probably one of the most valuable things that we can bring to the table. And it's a surprising one in how simple it is. But as far as I'm aware, there's never been a venue like ours that takes no position. It has nothing to sell. We mint no tokens. We exercise no editorial control. We're not a journalistic enterprise. We're not looking for, nor are we supporting drama or contention. Our role is simply to facilitate the surfacing of testable solutions for the blockchain space. We want to find actionable research We want to find researchers. We want to find industry. We want to connect those two groups together so they make blockchain better. So that's the recap of the problems in this space. I spoke a bit about how we are going about solving these things. We have a great deal going on and a great deal more planned. Lots of work available, and like most of the space, we don't have enough people to do it. So here's the call to the ecosystem. If you find what we just went over at all compelling, Scurf needs help. We have lots of positions available. We're looking for project managers. We're looking for editors, illustrators, community managers, researchers, junior, intermediate, and senior to join us in our mission. And once again, that mission, while it's not terribly compelling in a space full of unique crypto primitives and earth-shaking developments on a weekly basis, our mission is to provide support for the intellectual commons in the crypto space and do whatever it is we can to help push the space forward and provide support where it's needed across all chains, across all projects, across all faculties, across all regions of the world. If you found any of this particularly compelling, like I said, please join us. Put a link on the screen about where you can find us for more information and where you can join us in the chat. Looking forward to talking.
Thank you so much, Rich. As a former academic myself, I appreciate the initiative of Smart Contract Research Forum. It's a great place to start that bridge and continue the conversation and meet our industry with our academic research. So props to you and your team. And in that spirit, I wanted to, I'm happy to introduce some of the people from Smart Contract Research Forum for our next panel. I'm going to let the moderator, Lucas Nuzzi, introduce everyone, but the next panel is called Privacy and the Evolution of Snarks.
Hello, and welcome to the panel on Privacy and Snarks, organized by the Smart Contract Research Forum, or SCRF, as part of the Smart Contract Summit. I'm Eugene Leventhal, the operations lead here at SCRF. This is actually part one of the panel, as the conversation was just too good to cut short. You'll be able to read more about the panelists and to watch the rest of the video for free at smartcontractresearch.org/t/622. And with that, I'll pass it on to our moderator for this panel, SCRF's research lead, Lucas Nuzzi.
Thank you, Eugene, and welcome everyone to what's going to be a really fun discussion on the state of the industry when it comes to ZK rollups and the low-level protocols that enable them. And to have this conversation, we have two of what I consider the top researchers in the space doing work in this area. Ariel Gabizon, who has been doing research in this area for quite some time, now at Aztec Protocol, who's building a really interesting ZK rollup solution, as well as Alex Vlasov, who has also been researching this area for quite some time and has been working with ZK Sync in their various approaches to rollups. Gentlemen, welcome to the panel. Really a pleasure to have you on board. Maybe to kick things off, you guys can give a little bit of an introduction of yourselves and your projects, and we do have some questions to go over, but it'll be great to hear from you guys, the evolution of your research, what you've been working on, and the areas that you focus on. Maybe starting with you, Ariel.
Yeah, sure. So I guess, yeah, I basically spent a lot of years in academia doing math, computer science, and once basically I read the Bitcoin white paper, I felt that I should sort of get into this world, and the best way for me to do it seemed to be through these ZK zero knowledge proofs, since they were relatively math heavy with the sort of math I liked and was comfortable with. So that led to me working with Eli Ben Sasson back in Technion University in Israel, in the early days of Starks before they were called Starks. And then I sort of left academia to work on Zcash, the first trusted setups. The first sort of commercial use of Snarks was there, and that was really exciting. And and then a sort of a chance meeting with Zach Williamson led to this universal ZK snark called Plonk, which sort of, I think, really put universal snarks in sort of in the practical, made them very, very practical. And and then that led to me moving from Protocol Labs, where I was working, to Aztec to focus on this work with Zach and the Aztec team.
Excellent. How about you, Alex?
Well, regarding the way into snarks themselves, I was participating in ETH Waterloo. I think was actually the first one from ETH Global Series, which continued for a few years after. And at this hackathon, there was the talk, well, first by Vitalik on snarks, and then by Ellie on Starks. So this is when it first caught my attention in general for what's possible to do with the snarks at that point in time. Then I was working on plasmas in different flavors. Then at some point we decided to form a Meta Labs to bring the best from two worlds and kind of marry the rollups and ZK snarks to make the ZK Sync, the ZK rollup released a few years ago. So now we are continuing to develop it to bring in the version 2.0, and it should be able to run user-defined smart contracts, which should be compilable from Solidity and Sync, which is our developed programming language. Also not specifically for circuits, just normal programming. In theory, we should be able to even build Rust and run it in our architecture, but it's a little bit off topic. So yeah, along the way, I participated in improving snarks. As for us, it's more like a tool than something like pristine and fundamental. So for this purpose, we we published a small paper about the transparent polynomial commitments, which used Fry, and then which led into the expanded paper called the Redshift. So this was roughly my way into here. Now we're in the final stages to bring ZK Sync 2.0 with smart contracts to life, with basically all snark related work done. Now we just have to check the code, run the tests, and be able to release it so people can try a compiler, see how the VM was designed. Actually, we have to write a lot of manuals, but it's on a good track.
Yeah, it was super interesting background, and I think it ties things very nicely. I do remember when Vitalik first described what we now call ZK rollups, essentially applying this technology, which the industry had predominantly seen as an approach to privacy, with projects like Zcash applied to scalability, right? Enabling transactions to be processed outside of the blockchain, and essentially borrowing some ideas even from Plasma at a time when more research was coming out on the feasibility of Plasma that I would say disappointed a lot of people. So to set the stage a little bit, it would be interesting to talk about the commonality and the theme of the projects that you guys are working on, because when people think about ZK snarks, they still have this anchor towards privacy, right? Whereas because of the research that you guys have produced over the years, that theme has shifted quite a bit, right? From privacy to scalability. And now with recursive snarks, with the ability to program contracts using these systems and still carrying some of the benefits that snarks intrinsically have. So maybe to set the stage a little bit, Ariel, could you talk about recursive snarks and Plonk and what is it that enables these contracts to be generalized and really just granting the tools to the developers to build these contracts using this technology?
So I maybe one thing to mention is like, why are recursive snarks relevant to or essential to programmability? And I guess one part of that is if eventually you have one sort of verification contract that is constant, like say this is the contract that verifies the rollup. So this contract is fixed. It's not dependent on a specific program. So in this sense, recursion helps you because whatever your sort of actual circuit is, the final thing, the final program you're running is just a verifier. Sort of what is the relation between Plonk and recursion? So the first thing to notice is that in principle, there's any ZK snark gives you recursion because ZK snarks allow you to prove statements about any program. So you can always prove a statement about the snark verification program in particular. So recursion was never impossible theoretically. It was really a question of constants. And the concrete constants when...
If we think of the DAOs or these organizations, this as sort of greater than the sum of their parts, then you have to remember that the DAOs may have relationships to people, but we also have people's relationships to the DAOs. And one of the most important attributes for people's relationship to an organization they're within is some level of trust or consistency in that relationship. And so it's sort of a opposite of the desire to be able to make it do the thing you want because you want to do it.
Rich, you wanted to jump in? Still muted.
Sorry, I'm vaguely hesitant to raise the topic and feel free to shut me down. But one of the challenges I've had in this space over the last few years is that the word DAO is a euphemism and everybody brings a different definition of that word to the table. And I want to sort of clarify that for the purposes of this discussion, when we say DAO, are we talking about, is it a slow committee? Is it a co-op? Is it an organization of individuals? We have some form of treasury management, some form of polling mechanism for decisions, and some form of communication channel? Or are we talking about something that's a little more aspirational where there's rules and regulations and guidelines that are sort of been codified into another contract that speak to the mission of these organizations? Does that make sense?
I suspect everyone might have their own answer. I'm happy to.
That's the tricky part.
But I mean, I generally think of them, I wouldn't say aspirational. I would say that, DAO as a term, both decentralized and autonomous, are like historically political terms, and you can look up their sort of canonical definitions. And if you think of them as adjectives modifying the word organization, then you're just talking about an organization.
Some of those parameters, so that you can apply this technology to broader programs without the requirements of actually regenerating these strings, which increase kind of the potential attack vectors of these systems, right? So it really just enabled a way for you to reuse that SRS for plethora of applications that can then be granted the benefits of this technology. Is this a correct characterization?
Oh, well, that is, I mean, so that is another huge issue. universal snarks like Plonk don't require a setup per circuit. I was referring to this, I guess, other more low-level issue that to actually write the snark verifier as a program, you need to sort of simulate these field operations in a non-native field, and that was extremely inefficient before Plonk. But actually, maybe you're right that you're right that a much more basic issue, if you want recursion and user-defined circuits, so the universality is actually a much larger and more basic point. Otherwise you would need every user would need to run their own trusted setup.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of really interesting content. I think even the initial Powers of Tau ceremony from Zcash that you were one of the architects of. I think there's a lot of mysticism around what that actually entails, right, and how that is performed. But the basic idea is that string must be secure enough or random enough so that you have guarantees around the provers and verifiers of these systems. Alex, you've worked on this scheme called Redshift, right, which was a really interesting piece of research. And it basically introduced an interactive Oracle proof system that used polynomial commitments to essentially circumvent the need for a trusted SRS. Could you talk a little bit about Redshift? What motivated that research? Was it the security and more universal angle that motivated that research? And also, if you could also talk about the evolution of that research and what led you guys into Plonk as that research evolved, and maybe the trade-offs associated with that research.
Well, first of all, I should mention that so there was for Redshift and its history, there was no particular decision to do such research. The historical state at this time was that there was a DeFi paper by Ellie Rennie and his colleagues, which basically used FRI, proximity testing protocol, in some particular way, which allows them to have more efficient Stark. And here by Stark, I mean a proof system and the way of arithmetization, which is called AIR in the original paper. And basically what this paper was doing is very close to what the Plonk paper was doing in its original form, with just the polynomial commitments, which are kete commitments. Basically, the prover commits to the set of polynomials and then draws a random point, then make a standard trick of quotiening. Basically, if your polynomial is at this value at this point, then you can perform a formal division operation, and that the result will also be a polynomial. And then they use the FRI to prove that this result of the division is indeed very close to polynomial, which was sufficient for all the purposes of Stark as a proof system. But it was never called a polynomial commitment, even while it was doing basically the same as kete commitment itself, just in a different way. I read this paper, and then after half a year or something like this, there was a Plonk paper, which I seen was covering largely the same details in the same format. And only then I just randomly in a train actually had an idea, well, this is basically the same, and why no one tried to do it. And then we spent 2 weeks trying to convince ourselves that there was some trivial mistake and overlook, that this is very, very much the same idea. which was never covered. So then we made a very small paper on archive, which was basically talking about the polynomial commitments, which was strict commitments to only a single polynomial, and used Pry as a proximity testing protocol in a mode which is called unique decoding radius. A little bit simpler, it was testing that something which prover gave you is close to the polynomial, is like very close to polynomial. Let's call it this way for simplicity for now. And then we started to, which led to larger proof sizes, which was a problem with original Starks back then when they were introduced. They required very small radius for testing of proximity, which led to larger proofs. And then we decided to go beyond this, the same achievement which was done in the Deep Pry paper, to go beyond unique decoding radius, and this was done in the Redshift paper. And the main trick or like / problem with going beyond decoding radius was that now the prover is able to commit not just to a single polynomial, but some set of polynomials. The set is still small compared to the field size, so it wasn't the end of the day for most of for soundness, but it would be okay for witness polynomials. So the prover can give you something which is like maybe one polynomial out of 10, which satisfies the verification relationship. Was still fine for witness polynomials, but it would be a problem for setup polynomials which were present in all the proof systems other than Starks and others which are like for uniform circuits. Let's not go that deep into this direction. So we had to find a way how to actually pinpoint a single polynomial out of the set at the setup time, which was done in Redshift, which basically brought the best from the Starks world and basically transferred it to all the protocols which require polynomial commitments. That's why it was that's why it was demonstrated on Plonk itself, because it was first an original inspiration, and then the idea was that you can do the same, you can run the same proofs by just swapping the commitment scheme and maybe adding some factors in the soundness. So that's why the Redshift was made in a form which basically taken the Plonk and kind of changed it a little bit.
So actually,
go ahead, Ariel.
Yeah. So actually, Alex, what do you think really about the non-pre-processing Starks versus doing like Redshift? Do you think it's like, what if you had to choose between these two? What would you choose?
Well, I don't I have a preference for one with the pre-processing for reasons that it can be much simpler to write and designed by people who cannot just take the polynomials and write the polynomial protocol by hand on a piece of paper by basically linking all the witness values by themselves in a very large set of witness polynomials. So the problem with the protocols which are like Starks without pre-processing is that your set of constraints is so much non-trivial that first of all, it's difficult to design without mistakes. And the second, after you design it, it's unlikely that you will find another person who would be able to review it. But if your proof system is more universal in the sense that the pre-processing written once does everything for you, and when you design the circuit, you only write a code which is much simpler. So you do not manually take care which variable is located in what polynomial at which index, and you basically treat them like values and variables in any in some convoluted programming language. It eliminates a lot of mistakes, and it actually becomes auditable and understandable by a wider audience. That's why I think that there are more people which are able to write a Plonk circuit, or maybe understand the to understand Sprout or Sapling Zcash circuits than people who would be able to write a Stark to, for example, do the Peterson commitment. And Peterson commitment was actually quite trivial. For whatever people in Starkware did for the Cairo programming language, I can guess how it works. I didn't look in details and didn't try to reverse it, but I can guess how it works. But I think it would be non-trivial for anyone to try to try to write an external manual to how it's actually implemented. Even so, you will see a full set of constraints in the verifier if it's implemented as a Solidity contract.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's interesting to hear about the reasoning behind some of these trade-offs, right? I think if the research around even more recently with Plonk and its newer iterations and all of its predecessors showcases is that there are some non-trivial trade-offs at play, right? When it comes to usability, proving time, verification time, proof sizes, even complexity. What other trade-offs, fueled your research as you're thinking about, for example, shifting the commitment scheme, in this circumstance for efficiency purposes? What are the trade-offs that influence your research, especially as you're trying to build a system for Ethereum applications?
Well, I think one should actually separate two parts here. One is designing the final system in the sense that it's like what circuits you write, which is the functions of the circuits, whether those circuits require some recursive verification because they kind of proves different substatements of one larger logical statement, and so they require recursive verification. And another trade-off is purely regarding the proof systems and like concrete implementations of the recursive approach. For example, if you take the fractal paper, it was a direct comparison was done there. So the fractal paper is also transparent snark or Stark, like however you want, with the pre-processing. And what they did is they presented the size of the circuit which does the verification, a recursive verification of single statement, if you use one hash or another hash to construct the Merkle trees when you do the proofs. So if you use a standard non-algebraic hash, then your verification circuit is very large because non-algebraic hashes take a lot of constraints to implement, which was partially solved by the Plonk with lookup tables. We can cover it a little bit later. And another example they did, and they used the rescue hash as a hash to construct the Merkle trees, which led to much smaller circuits to implement the verifier, but which also led to the much larger proving time because the hash itself was very slow to compute. So this would be, I would say, I think more to the question which you asked originally, in the sense of different trade-offs. In a similar direction, you can view how many constraints does one recursive aggregation in Plonk take. And it also depends a lot. For example, if your verification keys are all the same, it's one number. If your verification keys are all different, it's completely different number. Like I think five times larger, if I remember correctly, like roughly at least. And this even would not be a complete verification, it would be aggregation, which is also a little bit different procedure. And Ariel can cover it in details, I think, much better than I do. So like for this, we should separate this talk and first maybe talk about the proof systems and trade-offs coming from proof systems themselves. And then you can try to talk about how you can actually try to implement a programmability kind of separately, and which is unlikely to depend on how on what proof system you take if you have the recursion. It's another like field of optimizations, I would say.
Yeah, that's a very interesting framing. I think that's exactly right. Right, you start with the proof system, and then recursion is applied, and then you have all the interesting benefits of it. But Ariel, were you going to say something?
What was I going to say?
I guess, do you agree with this framing? Is this the correct way to reason about the trade-offs of these systems?
What is that way again?
It was more about that you can separate this large equation made by Lucas into one is like what are trade-offs in proof systems and their particular implementations versus a design area of how you actually implement programmability. And from my perspective, those are like completely two different tasks. One is optimize how you implement proof systems and recursion, like particular hash function choices, commitment schemes choices, maybe something else. We can talk about this. And another one is how you actually make a circuit, which, for example, does the ZK rollup. And maybe verifies user-defined circuits and contracts. So I would say like two completely different deals for me, at least.
Yeah. Well, one thing just I think about you, Lucas, originally you, in terms of trade-offs of polynomial commitment schemes, I think right now the KZG, the Kate Zavarucha Goldberg one, is clearly like the winner, right? I think the only reason to use anything else is if sort of carrying friendly curves will at some point be crushed, and and then there'll be no choice but to use something else. Yeah, I don't know. I think there were a lot of parts of this of this question. Maybe maybe let's go to the next question. There's a lot of parts, so I'm not sure what to.
It's a loaded question.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you did mention something interesting with regards to pairing-based cryptography that we've had a couple of discussions in the past. And you, of course, a huge topic of your research is security. Ethereum uses a variant of BN 256 as a proving curve, or as a curve in at the base layer. ETH2 moving to BLS 12.381. What is your take on the security of these curves and maybe of pairing-based cryptography more generally? Do you think there will be a scenario in the short term, and here's another loaded question, where these curves need to change or setups need to change?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like asking, will Bitcoin hit $1 million, or let's say, will Bitcoin hit $100,000 within 3 months, 2 years, 5 years, never?
Is it a matter of when, not if?
Well, there is a question of if. It's really hard to say. You've got these number field sieve attacks that are what makes us go to larger curves. And it's really tricky to say. You occasionally have a new paper with some improvement, and then it's sort of like, how fast are these improvements going to go? Are they going to get stuck? Are they going to so it's really hard to say. I mean, I tried to understand practically how safe is BN254 for the next few years. Honestly, it's really hard to say. It's really hard to say if, like, okay, the current attacks need a little extra trick to to make it dangerous to use BN254, or there's going to be like 10 years till this trick comes, or it's really hard to say. One annoying thing is that you've got when you've got the Pollard's row algorithm, so the proof runtime is very well analyzed, but with these number field sieve attacks, they're saying, okay, this is the runtime under these number sort of theoretic conjectures, and then you're sort of like, okay, so should I update my code according to the more pessimistic in terms of not say the user, not the attacker? Should I update my curve according to the more pessimistic estimate sort of versions of these conjectures, or should I actually wait till there's because so these curves have 254 bits that we're using right now on Ethereum. So if you look at Zcash, for example, they the minute there was a paper saying, okay, there is potentially an attack on this curve, immediately they moved. So, what should be your and what should be your approach? The minute someone writes a paper where this maybe is not safe anymore, do you move then? Or do you say, well, show me an actual attack on, you say, okay, SHA-256 is not safe anymore. It has 80 rounds. Just show me at least an attack that breaks 70 of the 80 rounds. So equivalently, all right, show me an actual discrete log computation in a field that is, getting close to what we're using, and then I'll switch my curve. Or it seems, that the more what people are actually doing is the minute there's a paper saying, okay, this may be dangerous, they immediately move. They don't want more evidence. So honestly, this is a bit of a rant. When Zcash, when we moved so quickly, I was like, oh, we're sort of giving them too much, credit,
legitimizing it too much. But on the other hand, when I talked to some of these experts in the last few months, I don't know. It seems like they have a lot of tricks up their sleeves, and so it's this is sort of a long way of saying. I don't really know. I mean, it really is like the price of Bitcoin. How long will it take to hit the next the 100K? Is it going to be tomorrow? Soon? Is it going to be never? Is it going to be really slowly? No one knows. Yeah, it's an interesting area of research, and I think it's exactly what you said, right? It's really a matter of making these design decisions on a proactive or reactive basis, on the basis of how legitimate or how concerned from a practical perspective. Some of these attacks are. Klaus Schnorr recently said that he broke RSA, and is the industry completely moving away from RSA? It's not really happening. So it fits into those trade-offs. But is this something that as you're designing these systems that you guys take into consideration? Do you have kind of contingency plans if this were to happen? How proactive is that design? Because I would imagine it would be a non-trivial shift, right? If pair-based curves were to be, as you mentioned, at several rounds, be proven susceptible to some of these attacks. Or is that now part of those research decisions or design decisions?
Well, I think the nice thing is since
as a cognitive scientist, to do cognitive science, to understand, people, you need thousands or hundreds or maybe millions of people, and you got to be able to compare them. So from my perspective, to do social science, to study societies, you need a societal unit of analysis. You need opportunities to study lots of independent instantiations of communities, or in my case, governance systems. And so
like I can share here is the first one is Travala. It's a travel company. Of course,
Rich Brown.
Hi, my name is Rich Brown. I currently am the co-founder of the Smart Contract Research Forum. It's a venue devoted to connecting researchers, academics, and industry together to push the space forward. Previously, I was the head of community.
We are working with this team called Table Go. It's basically, if you go into that place, you can prove to the chain you have been there. Okay, the chain will give you, or maybe the DApp will give you an NFT card, so which you can collect more to forge them together to have some sort of valuable collections. So it's a very fun game, to play with. It will launch in 1 month or 2. And Omen is like a prediction market. Usually, like people just bet on the Bitcoin prices, Ethereum price in this kind of prediction market. But like with the real world information, so they can bet on something even like a more real, right? So will there be a traffic jam on like a US 101 highway, right, or not? Who knows? Then the first one is of course like the decentralized machine learning. So they are just collecting real world data to fit them into the training model we are doing. So hopefully we can have something like even more intelligent by having this sort of technology. That's about it. That's about my my presentation today. Actually, thank you so much, for listening. Yeah, I have to. Yeah. So if you want to learn more about IoTeX, about what we do different, like go to our website iotex.io. Yeah, and if you want to chat with me, like my email is just roland@iotex.io. Thank you, everyone.
Was like formative to the point where it didn't seem strange to me to like interact with a whole bunch of random people that I don't know online towards like some common goal. So the idea of like the Ethereum ecosystem never really seemed that strange to me. And it's interesting that like it does seem strange, or like prior to the pandemic did seem strange to so many people. But I think now there's a lot more understanding of the ability for people to coordinate online being like a core primitive of just like where we're at as a society. And I think that it's naturally going to be a kind of thing that like progresses over time. We probably still have a lot of work to do in terms of like, when we talk about people creating DAOs, the question arises, what is a DAO, right? And I don't think we're there yet in terms of really having like to something that Rich was saying just before we sort of started, like a formal definition of like or instantiation of what a digital cooperative should be in the future. But I think we're certainly making a lot of progress there. And I think that there's certainly been an acceleration just in this general idea of people coordinating online to like generate value being like a normalized thing. The other last example I'll just very quickly mention is Roblox, which is like now obviously a public company, now obviously very popular. And like, even I think that's part of the reason we're seeing like traditional Web2 folks, like even the standard sort of like DC Twitter folks, like now caring about this space. So I'll pause there, but that's certainly been my journey, I guess. And it's I think to me one of the reasons we're seeing so much popularity in this concept now.
I think just jumping a little bit on Scott's thought, like, and you alluded to it as you were introing Kelsey, and we also heard Rich talk about his participation both with online communities and then in cooperatives. Like it just strikes me that a lot of the people who are interested, it's almost the perfect opportunity for people who are interested in cooperatives to collaborate with people who are interested in online communities, because both different forums have so much important precedent to provide to those who are now thinking of setting up DAOs, and also determining what DAOs are. I mean, I think we've all alluded to that. Like, there's no clear definition as to what a DAO is, and there's a lot of different thoughts about what that could be. And that is an incredible ambition, I think, of some to take on that task to define DAO in a way that's meaningful and important to the community. And I'm doing a thing right now with the DAO Research Cooperative where we're trying to identify some of the most pressing issues for DAOs, thinking broadly like legal issues, governance issues, treasury management issues. And in a couple of the initial calls I had, that was the first thing that folks brought up. Like, I'm talking to different leaders in the space, and it's what is the definition of a DAO, whether it's related to the kinds of systems that a particular organization uses, or the kinds of obligations it has to its members, or a large variety of things. So when we think about why DAOs are popular, I think in part DAOs are popular because the definition of DAO is so broad that anything is a DAO today. But we might see a fall off in popularity when we may, start defining it more narrowly, or at least creating subcategories for DAOs.
I don't want to put you on the spot, though, but can you get us started? What is your definition of a DAO? What's your working definition when you're speaking to these people?
Ooh, that's so tough. I really don't want to dodge the question. And so maybe I won't. I just think that we're at such an early stage of experimentation that we've yet to figure out what a DAO is, candidly. And I know that's kind of a shady answer, but I was actually talking to a VC earlier today, and I was asking him about, when you're talking to organizations that you're looking to invest in, and they intend to ultimately become DAOs or like Dexit, how do you think about the way in which they're composing their DAO? How do you think about their timeline for decentralizing into a DAO? And that was really his response is, we're so early here that we actually don't even ask that question because we just don't think that someone could give us a serious answer. And candidly, I'm a little bit of the same mind. I was talking to Julia Rosenberg from Orca, and she thought very critically about this sort of stuff. And she was the first one to bring this up to me as a big issue. And from her perspective, and I don't want to misquote her here, but she was talking about uses of particular systems. So when I think about that, I would want, a forum for proposals. I would want voting mechanisms. I wouldn't just want a Telegram group. And so to me, it maybe very broadly is an organization that allows for decentralized governance, decentralized voting. But I would leave that very broad because I also have kind of a specific view on what members of a DAO should be able to vote for. And I'm not a huge believer in kind of a one token governance system either. So what we define as DAOs broadly today, I may not totally agree with. And I imagine that's probably the same for most people on this call.
I like that though, because at the moment, and we're talking about this process of how you get to a DAO, like the DEXIT acronym, so short for Exit to DAO, which is a take on Nathan Schneider's Exit to Community. But they're not decentralized yet in many instantiations, and they're not autonomous. They're kind of organizations. And I think a lot of the blockchain community is trying to figure out, what is an organization? Leighton, you mentioned a suite of DAOs that you're involved in. What's the varying mission or objective or goals of these different groups?
Yeah. So I think I draw one line very clearly in my DAO involvement. So pooled together, I wouldn't really call it a DAO, to be honest, because to me, it's a protocol that has tokenized governance. And some people call those DAOs, but I don't think of those as DAOs like Compound, Uniswap, even Maker. Like, if you're familiar with these protocols pooled together, I think of it as a protocol with tokenized governance, whereas Venture DAO and Pleaser DAO, they both have DAO in the name, I think of those as DAOs. And the difference in my mind is Venture DAO and Pleaser DAO are a group of people who came together to sort of actively go do new things. Whereas Pool Together is a protocol that was already established, already had hundreds of millions of dollars in it, already was functioning, and the control was just given of an existing self-perpetuating project to the community. And I think that's a very different thing than, in my experience in Pleaser DAO and Venture DAO, is they immediately become very hierarchical. But Pool Together is not.
And it doesn't have to be, because there's a very narrow space that like we're like making decisions about. And because we're not like debating like, you know, completely arbitrary subjects like we are in Pleasure DAO and Venture DAO. So that's how I think of them differently, which, you know, I'd be curious to hear Seth's input, because I think I would be curious how that maps to maybe like categories in a more academic sense, but that's at least from my personal experience.
Let's see. Well, categories. So I think that I have something a bit akin to folks here. This aversion even to defining a DAO, I think it's perfectly legitimate and from my perspective, encouraged to end with definitions rather than start with them. To have a word be the name of the thing you're trying to understand. It's consistent with a very iterative, empirical kind of approach that sort of represent, typical of the kind of experimentation that we see here. And in line with that, all governance taxonomies that I encounter in my work, I'd say most of my effort goes into trying to break them or push them, and I'm still struggling as you go across domains from a physical, real world, let's say nation state system, which is where a lot of our taxonomies come from, to a small scale self-governing system. I actually also got my start organizing cooperatives and moved into the online space after that because it's easier to do data science on. I'm originally out of the housing co-op sector. So taxonomies of small-scale governance systems, and then moving on to that into the emergent taxonomies of online communities, how they understand the differences between themselves. We are still not at a place where there's any kind of unified taxonomy or ontology, I could say, of the axes along which governance systems vary. And so I'm inclined, to everyone's disappointment, to come just as much as a watcher and observer than a holder forth.
Have you been tempted to, so the co-op space has been examined for the last 400 or 500 years, and there's a lot of subdivisions and categorizations and definitions there. Have you been tempted to sort of use those as templates to the new DAO ecosystem, or do you find that it doesn't translate?
Well, you know what? It's a really pleasant surprise to find so many people here coming with some kind of co-op background or interest in, in my understanding, I'm still figuring out the kind of mapping of ideological backgrounds of people in this space to the subset of kind of blockchain applications that they tap into. I do have one kind of litmus test I use for kind of knowing where to start talking to a person, which is, visualize utopia. It exists. Let's say utopia exists and we're in it and it runs out of a building. My question for a lot of people tends to be, are there any people in the building? So is governance a system that runs itself, or is it inevitably something that we're involved in, that we use as a set of tools to govern ourselves, that we're active in the work of governance? And one kind of sense I'm getting already from at least the folks in this small circle is that a lot of you end up more in the idea that it doesn't run itself, that we're active in the acts of governance. So if anyone wants to not be pigeonholed by me, I'd love to hear that.
So that's helpful. And to the point about the name referring to autonomy or not, Aaron Wright recently said in a Stanford piece that there are two main types of DAOs, participatory and algorithmic. But really, in what we've all described, there's both participation, or it's not a DAO, and there's also algorithms. So there's something happening through smart contracts and kind of automation there. So what are your views towards how much, or what's being automated? To Seth's point, is it the people being automated out of the system, or is it certain levels or functions kind of being automated to give autonomy to the people in the DAO? And then what does that actually mean?
I'll do a quick answer on that, because so like the idea of social scalability, like Nick Szabo's essay on that from, I don't know, the late 90s was definitely a super influential piece on all my work I've done. And And what caught my attention about that piece is that basically his thesis is like smart contracts lower the cost of trust. And so what's being automated is the human trust that's required to broker relationships. And when you can lower trust, when you can lower the cost of trust of entering into new relationships, you can have more relationships. And I think the ideal world, you can have like a more flourishing social reality because you're able to be in more relationships with more different people groups because the trust, the need to, the trust is what's being automated. So that's my 2 cents on it.
I definitely think that there's something to that notion. Like in particular, we aren't very good, Seth would know this much better than me, but Dunbar's number is a really important concept here where once you scale past 150 people, it's very difficult to actually have any idea of who those people are, to have real defined relationships with them. And I think what we sort of designed even beyond the idea of DAOs, in traditional structures, is this idea of well, what if we put in structures around voting, around what it means to participate in the system that are more formalized and less sort of normative, I suppose. And those structures sort of act as scaffolding that allows us to more easily coordinate with a larger group because there's processes that we can all agree on, even if we don't necessarily know each other. And that is the scaffolding into Leighton's point. It's providing that trust there. And so historically, that was very kind of opaque. It was just okay, well, these people have sort of decided on these rules, and so I guess that's fine now, and now we can all abide by them. We can trust these people in the tower to decide what these things are. And in theory, I wouldn't say necessarily in practice that with DAOs where they are, that's sort of what we're, to Leighton's point, automating.
I would say just kind of adding on to that and thinking about the way that different DAOs, I really like the idea of the trust created by smart contracts allowing for scalability, and even other tooling just the governance mechanisms and even single token in Uniswap or in Compound, for instance, the creation of grants programs. So grants programs are obviously there's a huge part, at least in those 2 organizations. There's a grants committee and they make assessments about projects and then they decide to fund them or to not fund them. And so there was a vote done at initial stages as to whether or not those committees should be funded. And in looking at MakerDAO too, and I know Rich could speak more to this, but as I understand it, when MakerDAO decentralized or became a DAO and maybe left the foundation world, there might be other structural pieces I'm not totally familiar with there, but some of the functions were allocated to or assigned to new organizations. And so there were just different organizations under the treasury or the DAO, however you want to state it. And so you members of the DAO, and this isn't specific to Maker, are able to make some decisions about allocating responsibility to other people. And this is potentially where the co-op structure becomes really important. As Rich mentioned, there's 400 or 500 years of exploration there. And so we appreciate that cooperatives have members, but the members don't make every single decision. They assign decisions to management. And so in that same way, we're seeing assignment of different responsibilities, sometimes to organizations and at other times to potentially individuals and DAOs.
Rich?
Sorry, I was muted. So it relates to something that Leighton was talking about earlier, where some DAOs are protocol management DAOs, and it's largely governance mechanisms around binary decision trees, basically. So we vote for this, we vote for that. Then there's engagements or creative, and the list goes on and on. But from the co-op model, that you're decentralizing or taking a committee model to a business unit. And so that's one of the ways that these more complicated, or to a business organization, that's why that some of these more complicated organizations are able to maintain themselves with more egalitarian decision-making processes, which in my mind kind of raises the question, and you triggered me with the Maker question, because as an organization becomes more and more complex, and all of its decision-making responsibilities get spun out to the community, is there an upper limit on the complexity of a DAO? Is it possible to scale, or are you sort of 3 steps past the protocol management level? Then maybe it's time to look at a firm instead, or does this group believe that DAOs can scale?
That's interesting. That because for me that brings up a little bit of a tension almost between where Rich is and where Leighton, Scott, and Connor are. For among Leighton, Scott, and Connor, it sort of seemed like there's an understanding that that trust didn't used to be scalable, and now it's scalable. But a little bit where Rich is coming from is, well, centralization is a great way to scale things. And because we have a background, because society has a history of centralization, scale hasn't really been the problem. We have scalable trust. There's centrally managed reputation systems. There's centrally managed currencies and centrally kind of architected, engineered market economies. And so then, so I'm curious, is there a conflict here? Is there a proposal that a decentralized scheme is ultimately more scalable than a centralized scheme? Are we challenging the scalability of centralized schemes? Or, as Rich is kind of possibly indicating, is the goal to get decentralized schemes as scalable as centralized schemes, and on top of that, expressing all the other benefits of decentralization?
Well, I was kind of hoping that Scott would jump in, because if I look at my crystal ball, Gitcoin is heading down sort of the same road. So these are the challenges staring him directly in the face. So do you have some insights, Scott?
Definitely, yeah. I think that's a fair assessment. My view would be that you have easy access to scale when you're centralized. Like it's very easy to scale, but it's simultaneously, I think, much more fragile than if you had a decentralized system, in the sense that like you don't actually have any kind of like redundancy against corruption. Basically, if like that centralized authority starts acting in some way that's incorrect or against the norms, or like is illegitimate, or anything like that, like you run into an immediate collapse of like that system, or maybe not always immediate, but like an eventual slow decline of that system. And that's what you see in like every country where there's being a government that's being active that suddenly like doesn't really deal with the people, or like have like any really connections to the people. And those sorts of situations tend to be much more damaging than if you had a system that was like slightly less scalable, but like kind of a bit more robust and a bit more like functionally accountable, I suppose. So I think there's trade-offs in those models, like between like how much executive function do you have and like how much sort of legislative function do you have and so forth. But like, I think one of the things we've learned from, and like the reason that like, I think democracies sort of are the prominent like sort of examples of governments that we have today is not because like they're perfect options. It's because like they're like kind of the least bad option, and they kind of aren't great, but like they kind of work, and like we don't have a better, in my mind, option at the moment.
I think a really Scott mentioned something which will trigger something for me, which is also in thinking about centralized systems, if you could develop partially centralized systems that have some level of checks and balances. Like we think about government, and there are 3 different branches of government, and the courts watch Congress, and the president watches the court, executive, judicial, and congressional is the third. But can we do something similar with DAOs and the corporation? Similar thing, board members and then executives. So some level of oversight, and then shareholders as well have certain rights too. So this is something that Justine wrote about in part, was when we're thinking about completely like for instance, maybe one extreme being token holders making every decision about how a treasury is used. And so instead of having a treasury management committee, which specializes in thinking really critically about every decision made, should we diversify and invest in a certain amount of stable coins and invest in a certain amount of tokens from other protocols, et cetera, you have the entire community making decisions. And so we could easily say, okay, that's not incredibly scalable. And then when we think about other functions too, like legal, for instance, if at some point you need to think about, okay, we're diversifying our treasury, what are the tax consequences of doing that? Who is the counterparty who's going to pay the IRS because they're going to be coming for us eventually? If you have, decentralized community, who is getting the memo from the lawyer? Because all of a sudden it's no longer privileged or confidential, and it could be used as evidence against you. So there are just a number of different ways that it can be very problematic to be fully decentralized in the way the world works today. So I think it would be hard to say that it's maximally efficient. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. But yeah, deal flow. Anything that requires some discretion is going to be tough in a down low, I believe.
So it's interesting to think about some of those kind of values-based or kind of ideological approaches to governance. But we've got some experts here in terms of actual experience of DAOing and, you know, trying to do decentralized governance. What are some of the challenges or strengths that are emerging in your personal experiences?
Not to jump in again, but one thing that actually really came up from that last comment was, it's funny because we did run into a very similar example of that problem with there was this whole Iquitos situation that's emerged, in which, for those that aren't familiar, there's kind of this history of people giving random tokens to Vitalik. And generally, it's not very favorable for Vitalik because he just gets these random tokens and then he's kind of like promoted as part of these schemes, and it becomes kind of an issue. In the Iquitos situation, it was kind of interesting because these original, founders of this token had dropped these, and then they had exit scammed at some point. So these other folks kind of started rallying the community and got to a point where during sort of the last peak of the market, there were just almost 100,000 people that were part of this dog token community. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because eventually Vitalik gave a bunch of these tokens to things like COVID India relief, to a lot of longevity-related organizations, and to us, to Gitcoin. And to Gitcoin, we got 50% of the supply of this Iquitos token, and it was entirely public in terms of how the community was deciding what to do with these tokens. And they originally just sort of said, well, we'll kind of sell these, we'll be done with it. And what they didn't realize is that decision was being made in an adversarial environment where everyone else was able to see that information. And so what that meant is that the Iquitos community responded. There was a kind of prisoner's dilemma of sorts that emerged. And we had to kind of the community of the DAO had to figure out basically what does it mean to go from a defect sort of state to a cooperative state. And eventually that happened, which was pretty cool to see in practice. But having these sort of executive committees in place would have probably been preferable for that kind of decision. And so that's actually been something that's been formatted into the DAO structure now, with these ideas of work streams and kind of these executive bodies that can make particular decisions while still being accountable to the overall organization.
For context, Gitcoin had been a DAO for a number of weeks when this vote was going on. And what was that treasury worth? What was the value of the Iquitos dog tokens?
Well, that's a tricky part because people say 500 million, but it was not worth that much because really the spot price of this sort of thing was not the same as liquidity. Liquidity was very low. It was maybe in the range of 5 million, 10 million. But to your point, it's a lot of money for a DAO has just come into existence to be how are we supposed to manage this treasury? What are we doing? And so it was certainly I was actually surprised that it even got to a point where it was something meaningful done with those, given that it was a 2-week thing. None of these, the stewards needed to represent the democracy system that was put in place based on this retroactive distribution. And eventually the stewards, who sort of roughly knew of each other through that process, but didn't really know much about each other, coordinated on this, which was kind of wild to see. But it's a very good case where executive function is needed.
Is there maybe a trade-off here? So, in a traditional business, these are decisions that happen in the boardroom. Nobody ever hears about it on the assembly line. But in the DAO space, have we replaced lobbying and public appeals and forum threads for committee decision or board decision? Is that because I followed the threads? They were enormously entertaining from my perspective. Sorry, Scott. When it was all happening, seeing this all play out in public in education.
I'll let Leighton jump in. I saw him put his hand up, but I would just say, I definitely think there's a balance between executive function and legislative function. It's a question of what that proper balance is, which is the hard question. But sorry, Leighton. Go.
I wasn't actually trying to raise my hand. I think I was doing something, but I think I was smiling because Rich, what I was honing in on what you just said was that DAOs still have a lot of back channels. There still is a lot of oh, before I propose this, I'm going to ask this person, or oh, I'm going to tell this person, so that's sort of what I was picking up on, Rich.
Well, I don't want to go down this road too far because there's a lot of interesting things to talk about, but that was very early on in the Maker development. It became apparent to us on the inside that at some point in the future, DAO lobbyists are going to be a thing. And I think that the ecosystem is kind of waking up to this. And I don't think that we're that far away from literal lobbyists like agencies whose job it is to get votes put through in various organizations, because it's public opinion now, and that's directly responsible. It's almost, well, I'm hesitant to say it's more effective than in traditional democracies, but we see direct financial incentives for votes to occur, and that's a very motivating force. And so lobbying, I think, is underappreciated how important that is in our space right now.
At this kind of level of abstraction, at this kind of strange mapping, the idea of lobbyists isn't going to be super different from the idea of a political party. Maybe in this metaphor, a party is just a lobby where the participants are also lobbyists. And so the literature in political science talks about how political parties exist to kind of coordinate units at different levels. And of course, there's skeptics about political parties, but there's this surprisingly large literature that's quite sort of optimistic about the importance of political parties as another kind of agent in a polycentric governance system, doing a lot of coordination work and lining up work, as well as, like in the case of nation states, like a talent finding and elevating kind of role.
You've seen some engaged participants, Leighton, in your ecosystem as well, with governance token allocations with various pools as well. Did you see any sign of lobbying pull together?
I don't think we've seen it yet. Not in any formalized way. No, but I do
hierarchy before too. If you could talk to that as well.
Yeah. I think I have like an unspoken idea that like DAOs are not hierarchical, or they shouldn't be. And I don't know if we would agree with that or not. But my finding has been that like in DAOs that are not associated with like protocols, they become very hierarchical very fast, because I don't think we have a way. I haven't experienced a way to like organize people and get stuff done without hierarchy. And maybe that's just my capitalist brainwashing, but like I haven't seen it yet. So yeah, the only other comment I was going to make too is one. I think an interesting dynamic I've seen in DAOs is that almost no one votes against anything. Like it's very rare to have controversial votes, and so it creates this weird bias where sort of whoever it is, I think to like Rich's, I think Rich, you're sort of getting at this a little bit. Like there's definitely a risk factor of like the people who are just paying attention can sort of push through whatever they want, because 99% of people aren't paying attention, or maybe 10% of people are paying attention, and that 10%, they just don't want to be negative. They don't want to vote against something. So like with Pool Together, like we'll have a good debate in the forums, but when it actually comes to voting, generally speaking, it's like 99% to 1%.
This sort of gets a subtle thing about governance and rules that is going, in my imagination, is going to represent kind of design challenges, and that's that. We kind of, especially for in the governance space, we think that rules are really important. We think of rules as the figure against the ground of possible action, especially if you have a very mechanism kind of focused view of governance. Then we define behavior in the system by defining rules. But a funny thing happened to some colleagues of mine who were doing actually ABM, so agent-based modeling of governance systems. And what they found was that, they define a sort of virtual resource and virtual behavior, virtual incentives, and then they define rules. And what they found is that rules got triggered actually very rarely, that rules were rules are just there to manage edge cases. Rules tend to be there. Rule violation and policy subtleties tend to be there for the weird things that happen.
Community has varying opinions of legitimacy of Anon projects these days and DeFi and adjacent projects, especially as smaller and unknown projects come to market or rugged and abandoned by their communities. What can Anon projects and builders such as yourselves do to prove that you're legitimate projects without doxing yourself, as mentioned before?
It's all about the output, I think. It's all about what you guys are producing, what are like the measure in place to, kind of bypass these rug pulls, all the audits and so on. It's really like gaining trust is a process, and it's all about being transparent. Like I will never trust, fully anons or like just typing. I don't trust people that are not able to come up with their voice, come up with not necessarily videos, but there's like you need to have some skin in the game a little bit. And the people not doing so, they don't deserve any trust, in my opinion. Or you assume that they will always quote unquote be evil until that is the key part. I think it's a process. Trust is earned, and at the end of the day, especially for anons, everything is on chain. Everything like code is law, and like the time log for Sushi, for example, everyone can see it. Everyone can see your actions. So that is why, and some people don't think it's good, and that's fair. But it's been 1 year. It's been highly successful, and we still are here trying to earn this respect.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think it's all about developing a track record, right? Like there's no substitute for just like this actions and developing trust with the community over time, as well as putting structures in place that, limit the amount of damage that's possible. And in Badger's case, it's a little more interesting because we have a mixed team, if you will. Like there are some people who go by their real identities and there's some people who are pseudonymous. And so we're probably in a little bit of a more advantageous position from that perception. I actually can't think of any other projects that are like that. It's quite interesting.
Anybody else?
I mean,
so
you just have.
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
All good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you just have to like establish a track record. It's as Maki was saying, you have to build trust. It's a process. If your team is shipping code, they're taking security seriously. They do minimum basic things like a multisig and a time lock for administrative functions. They cut out the ability to migrate and thus like rug funds from users and stuff like that in like farming pools and the protocol itself. Like things like that go a long way to securing people's trust in you. Another thing you can do with an anon team, and it's hard to do in a lot of DeFi protocols, is to make your code like completely ossified from like day one. You just release it and like that is the product, and like there's no parameters that can be changed, and the contract itself can't be changed. And that's like the most decentralized and secure thing you could do. And at that point, like as long as it's past audits, it doesn't matter if it's anon or not, because nobody can change it. And Sushi's like that for a lot of its like base functions too. So commend them for that.
So as your guys' protocols grow, are you going to reconsider being pseudonymous, or do you think it's best to be even more secure about your identity as you grow to make sure nobody knows who you are?
I think it's interesting because I think this kind of goes back to the point earlier of focus on the project. I think rather than being, keeping up with the anonymity, I think the goal is to kind of, blend in with the community at a certain point. I think like look at like Satoshi Nakamoto, right? I think, whether he's dead or he's alive, whoever the real alias was, Bitcoin continues to live on, even though there's not a Satoshi Nakamoto doing Chainlink Labs panels. And so, although some people might say that they are, and I think it's more about, a long run project view rather than I think even, you can get to this point of being anonymous and say, oh, I'm not about the clout, so I'm anonymous. But then if you continue to raise your anonymous profile, is that really better? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense to me. Does it make sense to everybody else in the group?
Yeah, I think like reputation is everything. That's what I hear, and I mean I find it to be true as well. I mean, even a non-anonymous identity or profile. I mean, when you come out to face the public, people still won't give you the trust right away, right? You still need to earn it. You still need to put in the work to gain the trust. I guess it's the same for anonymous profile, and I guess I mean. Referring back to OX Maki's point about having an alternative anonymous profile, I think the main deterrence there for most anons would be will be like, you kind of have to earn the respect again as well as an alternative anonymous profile. When like, you could just get a good rep and continue building up stuff, gaining trust from the public with the same anonymous profile. So I think it could be possible that that anonymous profile could just be like, you could identify with that anonymous profile just as much as you could identify with your actual name, for example. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you were to be running a team of 250 plus and growing people, do you think it'd be really, really difficult to remain anonymous while running such a large team?
I'm not really that anonymous within the organization. I think this is just a personal thing where it's like most of all of us kind of know each other, and even if it's like seeing each other and hanging out or something, I think it really helps, especially just even working together, right? And so whether it be 250 people, 1,000 people, or just one person, I think there's a veil of anonymity that, at least personally, we've tried to not contain within the organization, just so that we can, even internally establish some nuance of trust.
How would you say, sorry, please go ahead.
In contrast to that, like in Alchemics, like none of the members of our team have really doxed or shown our faces to each other. But to counter that, we've actually like been hanging out in like Crypto Degen Discord since 2017. And like for years, we had been brainstorming different app ideas and trying to build projects and, getting nowhere. And then finally, we had a really, really good idea in 2020 and built that. And that was Alchemic. So having that shared history with all those people and, being friends with them for so long, built up that trust. So even though we don't know each other, personally and don't know, much about each other's personal lives, we still, trust each other. It's sort of like NASA astronauts, they have to spend so much time training together. So like they can like anticipate, their crew, their other shipmates, like, every, feeling and thought and things like that. And I feel like our team has that as well, because we just know each other so well. It doesn't matter if we're, we can see each other's facial expressions or not.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely possible to build strong relationships without that aspect, purely through, text mediums and just like doing shared activities together. I do think it is easier being non-anonymous for sure. Definitely miss like, in-person interaction and stuff. But yeah, like at Badger, we're scaling the team quite a bit right now. And so I think that's been a relatively small part of it. It's mainly just about, we're just scaling an engineering organization, all the usual issues that come along there, as well as having like the decentralized twists on everything and trying to figure out those structures has been more of the issue than anything regarding like identities.
But by the way, Scoopy, that brings up something very interesting. They were knowing each other before forming this team. Whether or not they know in person or anonymous, they had like this background. Where it gets dangerous for all these kind of rogue kind of dev and so on and rug pulls is when you absolutely don't know the people you're working with. And whether you're hiring them, whether, you just kind of made a connection online, it can be very difficult to filter them out. And I think that's where having a basic kind of insurance, you know what, you're doxed to me, I dox myself to you. If we do something wrong, then guess what? You're in trouble. This is kind of quite powerful, actually, I think. Regardless, in some countries, potentially, like it might be harder and, you never know, maybe they give you false information and then you need to double check and so on. But this is a problem that, we had to face early on for ourselves. And, by bringing, of course, like dox people, that helps a little bit. But I don't think, personally, like I'm never against onboarding these anonymous kind of developers and so on. And from all the whole kind of sushi team, I know none of them more than, 1 year now because we had like sushi. So that is a very different dynamic than, like actually starting a project with people, that and now becoming quote unquote anonymous. Very different.
Yeah, we're very much limited to kind of like circles of trust for people who we can hire. Like if one person we're bringing on came from actually a referral from your coworker, Joseph DeLong. And
So one benefit I think in particular that I think is cool about this, and that maybe you can tell us a little bit more about, Ryan, is with regard to the nature of collateral in terms of what you can do with the solution like Deco plus Teller versus what's currently happening in DeFi.
Yeah, I think let's think about the origins of DeFi, and it is the financial system that we had been promised from the get-go. It is transparent to all, accessible to all, and you truly own your money. The origins of that will start in a place that's similar to the origins of traditional finance, where traditional finance began with collateralized nature of ways that you could say, hey, if I'm going to give you my chickens and I'm going to take a hen and I'm collateralizing to go do something with the money itself. DeFi has started that, and that's where we are with collateralization, and that's amazing for those who are already in the system. However, in order for DeFi to really service end consumers and break out of this notion of needing money to get access to capital, we need some type of form of reputation. And reputation comes from the history of data that a user can acquire over time by utilizing their interests, their activities, and their engagement in different applications. The best types of data, or the highest quality types of data in relation to DeFi, are going to be financial interactions. So that'll include your FICO score if you're in the States. That'll include your banking interactions or your mobile payments or your P2P payments in other regions in the world. And those pieces of information that you've built up over time in the traditional world should carry in somehow into the DeFi world, into the space where money can be transparent. And that's really where a lot of this innovation between Teller and Deco comes into play as we aim to lower collateral ratios in the space. One thing that's interesting to note is that the traditional world of credit doesn't necessarily work without collateral, but it works with the ability to give an individual access to capital before they have it. And I think that's the aha moment, which will happen as you see reputation coming into the space. The over-collateralized nature of today, where you need capital before getting capital, will be replaced with a world where we can give a user capital in order for them to do something with that capital, even if that capital has some type of collateral aspect in it in the backend. An example of that would be a mortgage. A mortgage has the house being used as collateral. However, the user, the borrower, doesn't necessarily have the full amount of capital to put down on the home at the start. In addition, you can think of your reputation in terms of your use of a credit card as collateral. It's just shifting the concept of what we think of collateral from being just capital today to being reputation and other world assets tomorrow. And that's what Deco can unlock in a privacy-preserving nature through applications like Teller.
Cool. Frank, can you tell us a little bit about how that works from a technical perspective, or what is it that makes Deco uniquely able to do this here? Why, for example, don't we just put the bank account data on chain, right, and then enable Teller to do its credit scoring based on that?
Right. So, yeah, there are two really technical kind of features of Deco that enables this. The first one is to prove the data came from the authentic source, right? You can't just put the banking history data on the blockchain because the data doesn't come with digital signatures to ensure its authenticity. So a malicious prover could easily modify the data, right, to pose as a millionaire while he only has, $10 in the bank, banking account. Another important feature that is enabled by Deco is privacy, right? You want to share your transaction history to, for example, take out the loan, but in the meantime, you only want to share what is absolutely necessary. And there are solutions that enables you to share the API access to your banking account via some third-party platform, for example. But that usually reveals more information than what's needed, and that doesn't give user a full control. While DECO changes this by giving user, very specific control of which data to reveal and being able to prove the authenticity of the data at the same time.
What Fan is bringing up with user control is really prominent here. The ability for a user to opt into what data they share is a brand new paradigm that is only going to happen because we're building it from the ground up in terms of this type of technology, both in parallel with Oracle's blockchain and DECO itself. And this is going to be a revolution that changes not only finance and how users interact with finance, but every other jurisdiction where you have some type of data that the user has built up.
Yeah, I think that control aspect is very important. And I mean, one thing in particular, right? So with DECO, for example, you could prove some statement about your bank account without actually giving the credentials. So for example, the password that you need to access the account details in your online bank's API without revealing those to anybody. And I think that's on its own already a hugely useful feature. Without even yet talking about the other aspects of the zero knowledge proofs powering DECO and the even greater privacy guarantees one can provide with those. So I think we'll go a little bit more into this through the talk, anyways. So I guess my next question then would be, what types of new data are we enabling to be consumed by smart contracts here, right? So you mentioned some examples of all of this credit score data, of financial data, but are there types of data beyond that will also be unlocked by DECO?
We like to think of it in three ways. One, you have the actual data itself, and that can span many different regions. That can be banking information, credit information, social information, GitHub information. All of these different types of information are just data points on a user. Those data points become really interesting when they can be scored. So an example of a simple score would be if you take someone's Twitter follower count, and instead of taking the number itself, you apply it to a log function where you say, if someone has one Twitter follower, they get a score of 1. If they have 10 Twitter followers, they get a score of 2. 100 Twitter followers, a score of 3, and so on. That final score is more interesting because it tells us a higher level of information about the actual user. That simple example of Twitter can be drawn out in much more complexity to banking or credit scores. But the beauty is something of very simple arithmetic can lead to a lot of information being known without ever revealing that information, just because you have that highest point, that credit score. So the first thing that smart contracts will be enabled to consume through this partnership with DECO and Teller is credit worthiness. That's an estimation of a user's ability to repay a line of credit based on their history of the data that, as we've talked about, they themselves opt in to share. So they could be sharing their Twitter data, they could be sharing their credit data or their DeFi history. It's up to the consumer what they want to share. And we're going to say, based on the actions taken, here's a score that the smart contract can consume. The second,
cool. And what I want to emphasize there, just to make sure that's super clear, right? The only data that's revealed in the end publicly on chain is the score, not the various bits of information that went into it. And the computation of the score itself is done in a privacy preserving manner, right? So in this case you gave, for example, the number of Twitter followers would not be revealed, and neither would be any other, say, financial information that you would input into the score.
Exactly.
But still, we can kind of implement various flexible scoring functions here, depending on the needs of, for example, Teller or the consuming protocol.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example. In addition to DeFi, I think another area that DECO can have a lot of application in is identity or decentralized identity, because DECO can bring off-chain identity data to smart contracts in a privacy-preserving and also trustworthy way. Well, so that will enable, applications even beyond the scope of DeFi and so on.
Do you have an example of such off-chain identity-related data that it will enable to be?
So any data, about that proves a certain property about somebody is a credential, right? And for example, data from government websites such as DMV could be used to prove or verify one's age and can be an age credential. Okay, and an identity is can be seen as a set of such credentials, right? And the basic idea of DID is for users to collect such credentials and form their own identity and control that identity, using the cryptographic techniques provided by, some are provided by DECO, right?
Okay, cool. Are you guys planning to do anything with DID, Ryan?
Yes, we are. I think this idea of a self-sovereign identity will happen, and it's going to start first through reputation. An analogy I like to compare it to is at the onset of crypto, the story we used to tell was about the dark web and kind of the trade that was happening on it and Bitcoin being used. But the market sellers, the people selling into the marketplace, actually weren't trusted until there was some type of reputation built in. And I think that shows that as we want to build decentralized applications where you may not know the name of an individual and you might not know their social security, you can trust that there's some form of identity or reputation associated with it. DIDs and the Web3 standard are going to be paramount in that evolution. And the way that we start to view this digital metaverse of what we call DeFi or NFTs or DAOs today as something real. And we all have a piece of us that will be brought on chain. And that's how Teller will be using DIDs.
Okay, cool. I think this aspect of combining the various parts of off-chain data or credentials in a way that the user controls and the user can choose what they want to reveal and what not could be hugely beneficial for privacy in general. Because I mean, right now, there's some shadow profile about each and every one of us with probably a lot more data than we're even aware of. And putting that control back to the user is certainly very exciting to me. So maybe then the next point I want to go into a little bit is about DeFi, right? That's sort of the hottest game in town right now. And so I'm curious, Fan, if you could tell us a little bit more about how exactly you can see DECO being used in DeFi and, be very specific about how that would look like.
Right. I'd love to see DECO being used to unlock the value in private data, including, for example, the private financial data, while giving users full control, right? I'd encourage everyone to pay attention to all the places where, you have to review way more information than what's necessary, right? For example, when every contract you sign, you need to review a lot of information that's not necessarily directly related or necessary to making the agreement go through, including in many financial applications. Right, for example, even just showing your ID to prove your age gives somebody access to your home address. And smart contract that utilizes DECO technology gives me hope that we can move to a more trustworthy and private form of agreement sooner than many may think, because DECO, as I said, taps into the existing infrastructure, right? It doesn't require, for example, banks to make changes in order for this to work. So that's, I think, where I'd love to see DECO being used, in DeFi and in providing credit worthiness data to smart contracts in privacy preserving and the user controlled way.
I think that's a really interesting point you mentioned there as well, and I think you've mentioned it already a few times as well before, that DECO is backwards compatible, right? So all of the existing systems out there, whether they're with banks or the DMV or other institutions that are not exactly known for their agility and their fast adoption of new technologies, we can still bring into the sort of 21st century by using DECO and use the data that they provide in a privacy preserving manner without them having to do anything or there being a dependence on them modifying their systems for everything to work.
And I think
so. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan. Yeah.
What's great is that we've shifted from a world where those backward compatible places today have just sucked up data to a place where they do want to give their users their data. And at least with GDPR, there are requirements for that to happen. So if a user wants to ask for their data, they're able to. And that data through Deco can be converted into some type of access to capital, which really starts to expand the set of how we can address capital markets, not only from the stance of DeFi and money markets on chain and how liquidity providers get rewarded, but to the flip side, which is what Fan is speaking on, where your data, as it has been built up over the past 10, 20, 30 years, now unlocks an enormous amount of value, not only for the consumer, but also for these businesses that have been holding the data to date. You can see places where the user may be monetizing their data, but the business could offer some type of credit integration or DeFi integration that is really going to unlock their entire user base to get access to that data and use the data. I think another piece to harp on is that users don't outwardly go get their data or grab their data. To date, many users who are not in the crypto space are just okay with these data storing places. So I think as DeFi becomes more embedded into these innate systems, when you see traditional fintechs integrating DeFi as a backend technology, that's when you're going to see these fintechs or big companies today become incentivized through DeFi to actually enable their users to monetize this data and give their users their data back.
And so in the end, as a user, I might not even necessarily know anymore that I'm using a DeFi-backed system. I just have a nice UX, and under the hood, it uses the DeFi system, if I'm understanding it correctly, Ryan.
And you'd be happy. Deco preserves the privacy, Teller gives you your credit, and the user walks away as if it happened in the traditional world today.
Yeah, that's a good point. Legacy compatibility is not only important for kind of fast innovation, but also important for user experiences, as you guys have been talking about. And also at the same time, it's a technical challenge. In some sense, it's easier to build a new and a flashy system without any constraints, right? If we live in an ideal world, building a new protocol would be easier. But we're not. We have to make do with existing systems over circumvent limitations in current technology, and that's an important kind of feature built in Deco. So we want to support legacy system from the get-go. That's part of the design.
Cool. Yeah, with regard to the legacy systems, I'm always reminded of the whole IPv6, IPv4 migration, where IPv6 came out years ago, and everybody knows it's a new standard you should be moving to. But just because the migration is so hard, it's still not done, and we are now at still less than 50% of web traffic and internet traffic using IPv6. So yeah, I think there again, this goes to show how hard it is to migrate systems that are not backwards compatible, and so the backwards compatibility is certainly a huge feature there. So I guess one other question then, we've talked a little bit about what Deco is, how it works, what it can provide in general, but I'm curious about your personal thoughts as well here. Like, where do you see this being most useful in the next, say, 2 to 3 years? What do you think will be the most exciting use case to you personally?
Yeah, I can kick this off. I mean, I think this is the most interesting question as we kind of predict where not only the shape of the market goes, but what people want. And DeFi today, at least in my eyes, has only started. It's only touched the first wave of innovators or really early adopters that have been very excited about the technology. If you look at capital markets today, the world of credit is what underpins the entire economy. In the States alone, the credit markets for consumers is about 15 trillion. That's if you combine credit cards, mortgages, and insurance. And then for businesses, it's about 15 trillion as well. Sorry if I said billion, I meant trillion. That is the underpinning. Yeah, much bigger than I said. That's the underpinning of our economy. And that's just in the States alone. That's where I think the real exciting growth of DeFi will happen as we get to bring these massive markets on chain.
Right. I would even add to that and say I personally think DeFi can't go truly mainstream until it can leverage off-chain data, financial data and so on. And, for example, most loans today in the off-chain world are under collateralized, but whereas in DeFi, you must put down $200 in order to borrow $100, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I'd be very excited to see DECO change this in a relatively short term, as DECO can provide credit data, for example, to enable credit-based loans rather than over-collateralized loans. And I'm also excited about the DID applications. It would be awesome if one day we can authorize through blockchain, proving properties about ourselves without revealing unnecessary information. Right? I want to prove I'm over 18. I just reveal one bit of information instead of giving away my home address for no reason. Right? That's exactly what can be done with DECO, and I think that can happen rather soon.
Okay, cool. It's crazy generally how much information one has to, or how much information beyond what is required for whatever application one has to leave everywhere these days, right? From opening up some account where you need to prove that you're a resident of a certain country, sure, but why do they need to know my address, as you mentioned, Fan? Or I need to prove that I'm beyond a certain age to maybe buy alcohol or cigarettes or whatever. But again, why do they need to know my exact birth date? And then this expands more and more to various other spheres of life as well. And especially, I think, in the digital realm, the amount of extra information that we share that we don't actually have to share for whatever business purpose is being achieved in any given business transaction is insane. And I think being able to bring control back to the user there and making sure that users only ideally share the minimal amount of information needed for the specific use case, but no more than that is super exciting. And I think being able to do that then in a legacy compatible manner too with DECO is really unlocking a lot of potential. And I'm super curious where this will go as well, and what applications we will be seeing here. Maybe even completely beyond DeFi and in realms that we haven't thought about yet, or that we're not yet aware of. So with that, maybe Ryan, you can tell us a little bit. You've been talking a lot, obviously, about Teller and what excites you there, right? But if you completely remove the financial aspect, is there some product category where you would be excited to see this being used, just from a personal perspective?
Yeah, I think from the point, there's three places. I think identity, healthcare, and then climate. We pour over so much of our information whenever we want access to something. That idea that you can summarize my birth date or my age into just a true or false is incredibly empowering, because no longer do you need to know that personally revealing information about me or judge me based on those characteristics. You can simply know that I'm within a category of yes or no. One, that's identity. I think two, healthcare is going to be completely rewritten. The world of data kind of aggregation today in healthcare is run by a couple major medical record holding platforms. And it's not easily accessible for the end patient to understand their data, see their data, and really have a confident analysis of it. That is going to give and empower us with our most proprietary information, which is what is our healthcare. That is going to be a revolution, I think, just in general, and how we perceive data and how we use data, especially about our personal lives. And then I think the third is, as the climate continues to change and evolve, and I think as a lot of people in the crypto space do want to have climate preserving powers and protocols and projects in place, we want to see that data in live time in ways that we can better serve the climate in trying to reverse the change that is going on, is becoming more drastic year on year. That's where I think DECO privacy preserving information will incentivize people around the world to share information about their general, regional, geographic position, and incentivize people to start making change within the climate. But we'll only know that through data. And part of the reason that we've been hampered at a lot of these points, be that identity or healthcare or enhancing and solving different issues with the climate, is because of this lack of data collaboration and data sharing, because there has been no reward to it. Now that you can make data private through Deco and you can share that collaboratively and get potentially paid for that, it will open the gates to innovation. In the same way that having a distributed ledger opened the floodgates for innovation within finance, I think we're going to see that in many different regions and jurisdictions and areas because of this idea of private data powered through Deco.
Okay. Fan, is there any areas that you are particularly interested in or that excite you beyond the financial applications?
Actually, Ryan just reminded me of another application we had in the Deco paper, which is personal marketplace, privacy preserving personal marketplace. Really the power of Deco, I think, can be summarized as enabling user to share the data while in a controlled way, and that aspect, in my opinion, is missing in the current data marketplace design. Right? If you want to go about and kind of sell your data and get profit from it, you want that control, and at the same time you want to prove the data is trustworthy so that the buyer can verify the correctness and make sure they are paying for legit and correct data. So so that's a really interesting application we kind of talked about in the paper, and it would be interesting. I'm glad to hear that Ryan also think that potential commercial there's potential commercial values there. Yeah, so that's something I think is also really interesting.
Cool. And I mean, I think it's worth emphasizing here, right? We are building Deco to be as general as possible. And so I think there's probably applications that will be enabled by Deco as we're building it that go even beyond what we have imagined so far and what we're able to imagine. Because once you let a global crowd of smart and enthusiastic developers build things on top of whatever platform you're providing them with, they usually come up with stuff that probably nobody would have predicted when the platform was first envisioned. So I'm personally also very curious to see what applications will come out of this that we haven't even thought of yet. I think with that, we're at time. And I'd like to very much thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Fan, for taking the time to join us today. Thanks for the great conversation.
Thank you for having me. Excited to have been here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for that panel on Deco, Lawrence, for leading that, and we're really looking forward to see how Deco grows in the future. Up next to our final panel for the day. Really excited to have this fireside chat. Some luminaries in the space, moderated by an absolutely stellar reporter, Cami Russo. So we're here to talk about if you love it, set it free, the realities of decentralized power transfer. With that, I will let Cami introduce our guests, and we'll get started here in just one second.
Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you, Chainlink, for this awesome conference. And I am so excited for this panel. Should be so interesting. If you love it, set it free, the realities of decentralized power transfer. And it really kind of captures the essence of the moment in DeFi that we're living, this push towards greater decentralization. And we have the leaders of two of some of the best examples of this. So Robert Leshner, the founder of Compound Finance, and Kane Warwick, the founder of Synthetics. Thanks so much.
Hey, Cami. Thanks, Camila. Excited to be here.
Okay, and I'm the founder of the Defiant, a content platform focusing on decentralized finance. Hopefully you are all subscribed to our newsletter and the YouTube channel. I should also say we are all members of White Hair Avatar group, though you're a bit cooler. I mean, you're crypto funds. I'm World of Women, which is also pretty cool.
Nice.
But I just noticed that fact. So this is super interesting. So as a brief intro, Synthetics Foundation dissolved itself a year ago, handing over control to 3 DAOs, and likewise Compound tokenized governance last year, replacing the administrator of Compound Protocol and leaving its decision-making process to its community of token holders. This was a long process. It took a couple of years for both protocols. So we will be discussing why this decision was made, what the steps were to get there, and how's it going so far. First, though, because this is a Chainlink conference, I'll start with a nod to our host. So can we start off just by each of you talking about how you use Chainlink in your own protocols?
Sure. Yeah, I can go first. So, one of the biggest points of centralization in the early synthetic system was our proprietary oracle that was being run by the Synthetics Foundation. And, even before we got to the point where we were ready to dissolve the foundation, we knew that we needed to get that sort of central, failure point away from the foundation and out into some other process. And so, we looked around and thankfully, some smart people and the guys from Framework connected us, with Chainlink. We'd been kind of talking to them for a while, and we were like, okay, this is it. Like, we're ready to do this. We sat down, we talked to Sergey, and we talked to a bunch of the people on the team, and we're like, this is the path forward for us. And we were one of the first groups to kind of implement the Chainlink oracles, which was a huge step forward for us. Because at the time, this was something that we were basically maintaining, constantly, right? And so, I think, I think we were able to get away from that very centralized component that we had, and that was something that was a big step in removing the need for foundation that had to run all this infrastructure and had to have servers and uptime and all that kind of stuff.
How about for Compound?
Well, for Compound, this is actually going to dovetail with the theme of the conversation, which is governance. So Compound uses Chainlink for our price feeds. And this is actually a process that unfolded through community governance for us, which is really exciting. So, like Kane mentioned, this is something that started off entirely centralized. And for Compound, it went through really 3 stages. One was an entirely centralized price feed. The second was an open price feed, which the community could decide what the price inputs would be. And the third was, the community choosing to use Chainlink as the primary input into the pricing system. And so for us, we're as a community now using the Chainlink price feed. And this was a process that unfolded through the decentralization process.
Very cool. Okay, so yes, that does dovetail nicely. So back to the topic of decentralized governance. How did you come to the decision of giving up governance to token holders? Was this a plan for the start, or did you come to the realization that this was kind of the way to go as you were building your protocol? And yeah, maybe Kane, you can start again.
Yeah, so I think at the start of our project, there were a lot of people that were very skeptical about the approach that we took, which was to have this sort of rapid iteration. We had these proxy contracts that had a lot of control over the protocol. We could iteratively update the contracts and did so quite regularly. And there was rightly a lot of skepticism around that because there was a question of, well, who is doing this, right? There's this software foundation that has all this control. There was not the same level of sort of decentralization as you had in something like Ethereum, where there are multiple parties that were participating in this process. It was really just, you know, a software foundation that was kind of rolling out changes to the contracts, and there wasn't a lot of oversight in how that could happen. But we said from the beginning, there will be oversight. We will hand it over to the community. Token holders will take control. And, you know, the skeptics obviously were rightly had some questions at the time. But I think over time, we've kind of been able to demonstrate that that was genuinely our intent. You know, we intended to do that from the beginning. We've kind of adhered to that. And I think in reality, where we've gone to now is far beyond what I think we contemplated at the beginning. You know, we had an idea of something that would have some aspect of token holder control or whatever. The current synthetics governance framework is probably far more decentralized than, you know, I could have imagined back then when we were talking about giving some control to token holders in this process.
So interesting. So were you initially thinking that you or the team would retain some level of control and some parts of the organization would be open to token holder governance, but in the end what ended up happening is that everything is now up to token holders?
Yeah, exactly right. You know, we thought that there would be some kind of like checks on power in terms of like token holders being able to like prevent certain things from happening, or like stage gates needed to, you know, to kind of process things. But in fact, it's actually gone much further than that. So, you know, we have a representative democracy. We've got a council, which is voted in by token holders. They make decisions on changes to the protocol. You know, there's very little that, you know, obviously the foundation's been, you know, even dissolved, right? So, you know, that component no longer exists at all. But there was a sense that there would be like some level of power kind of retained from the core contributors, you know, the people that were building the protocol. And in fact, there probably remains a little bit of control, but it's far less control than I think we anticipated at the beginning when we started this process. You know, the token holders really do drive most of the activity in the network now. Obviously, there's people implementing the changes, but other than that implementation component, it's 100% controlled by token holders.
Got it. Super interesting. How about for Compound? Like, was this type of governance always the plan?
To build a financial market that would run for 100 years. And you can't have a centralized entity controlling something that's going to run for 100 years. I mean, most corporations on earth, even the biggest ones, are not 100 years old. And, you know, our analogy that we always used internally was that if Bitcoin were run by the Bitcoin Corporation, it would be worth zero, you know? And so the goal was always to create an anti-fragile system that would outlast any member of our team. And so to get there, it was essentially mandatory that we would find ways to decentralize. You know, it's the ability to remove human error. It's the ability to, you know, remove, you know, sovereign state level interventions. It's the ability to build a system that developers and applications can rely on, that it's going to be there, not just next week or next month, but like next decade. And so, you know, we always knew that decentralization was mandatory. It was more a question about how to get there, when to get there, and what the steps would be, because there was never really a playbook that we were able to just take off the shelf to follow. We had to write the playbook, and now a lot of teams in DeFi can follow it, which is one of the greatest things we've done. And so, you know, from Compound's perspective, you know, we had to learn a lot of things in real time. You know, we were able to observe some of the best practices and worst practices of other teams that were a little bit ahead of us in the process. We learned a lot from MakerDAO. We learned a lot from synthetics. We learned a lot just from different experiments happening in crypto. But for us, we had to essentially design, you know, a process of handing over control of the protocol to the community. And that became the Compound governance system. It's, you know, I think a best-in-class system for voting on code changes to a protocol without any intermediaries. One of the failures we had seen elsewhere was, you know, needing like a foundation or a middleman to like even like put things up to a vote. We wanted to design a system that was, you know, completely open to improvement. And so, this became the compound governance system. At this point, a lot of other teams are able to use the governance contracts. We're seeing like compound governance and the time lock and the voting style and the token itself being used everywhere. Open Zeppelin is using it as a standard library at this point. And this is, the end result of it is now there's like almost a generic governance system that we were able to create that others can benefit from as well.
Very cool. Yeah, white labeling governance. Yeah. It's a great point because both compound and synthetics are, some of the earliest DeFi protocols. So you really did have to write the playbook on governance. Like you didn't have much earlier kind of examples or kind of rules to follow. So what elements and structures did had to be in place for your protocols to get to where you felt comfortable delegating governance? I'll
go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll take the pressure off of Kane. So the most important thing for Compound was knowing that if we were going to hand over control to the community, the protocol had to be in a state in which it was operating with stability, that there wouldn't be a bug discovered overnight that a community would have to respond to. What we wanted to do was have enough of a Lindy effect, knowing that if we handed over control, the community wouldn't likely have to respond overnight to any issues that would arrive, that any issues could be solved during like a 1 week governance process, knowing that the compound governance system is relatively slow by design. And so we had to essentially wait, at least a year from our last major code changes before rolling out governance. So really it was a lot of like, hurry up and wait and do nothing in order for it to be stable enough that we felt confident allowing the community to be the ones managing the protocol.
Okay, so basically making sure that the code was sound, that there were like no major bugs there.
That's right, because one of the biggest trade-offs of governance versus centralization is in centralization, you have the ability to respond and move extremely quickly. In decentralization, you lose some of that. And I think over time, the communities are going to figure out how to be able to move extremely quickly with decentralized governance and control. But right now, it's more of a trade-off. And so, before we moved over to decentralization and community control, we had to put it in a position where they wouldn't, have to, face like, as many technical risks.
Makes sense. How about like something about the community itself? Like, were there any like signs that you were waiting for to see whether the users or like the community was strong enough to handle that level of responsibility?
Well, we tried to ease the community into it. So one of the things that Compound did, which was relatively novel, which we actually haven't seen replicated elsewhere, but I think is a pretty useful model, is we essentially had an alpha test of public governance before we rolled it out to the entire community. So there was a 3-month period prior to the comp token being distributed to users where we tested voting on the protocol with a number of stakeholders, with like prominent members of the community. It was almost like a compound council in a way, like the synthetics council, but it was like, we found 20 or 30 people that were participating in running the protocol. And it was like an intermediary step from, a single team to the full community. And we were able to test a lot of the like proposal process and governance tools and ensure that everything was starting to run smoothly and that enough stakeholders knew how to enact changes that, once we rolled it out to a broader audience, there would start to be a muscle memory.
Cool. Okay. So making sure that there are no major bugs, running tests with a smaller group of users and making sure like all the tools worked and people knew how, like what they had to do. How about for synthetics?
To go back to an earlier point that Robert made, which I think is pretty interesting. The fact that there was very little in terms of governance out there, in terms of governance frameworks. Probably Maker was one of the few examples. There were some non-Ethereum examples that I think had gone even less well, but like Maker was like one of the few things that was like out there, right? I think the fact that there was so little in the way of a playbook or off the shelf components that you could use, and everyone had to kind of build their own thing, is one of the reasons why, if you look at the kind of older DeFi projects, their governance is so different. Like compound governance and synthetics governance, I think are quite different. It would have been amazing to me if the compound governance model, was there, right, as a piece of software that we could have used when synthetics started to, decentralize. We probably would have used it as well, I think, right, or used some component of it. But in fact, we were kind of building in parallel these separate systems, and the same goes for a number of other projects. So it is just quite interesting, I think, that today as a project you can kind of come and cherry pick little bits and pieces, and it's a much easier process. And we are definitely converging on something that makes sense. Obviously, there's always going to be trade-offs with different projects and what they're optimizing for, but I do think that most of us would have had a much more similar governance structure if we'd had the ability to kind of work collaboratively, through that process. But in terms of how synthetics governance played out, we, have always had this view of small iterative experiments. So we started off with like letting people, make really small decisions in Discord that were kind of inconsequential, right? Like, it was very trivial things, not even like parameter changes, just like things about, what we were all going to do or whatever. And we slowly added to that and handed more power over. And as we did that, we needed to work out new mechanisms for handing that, who was that power going to be handed to? How were they going to exercise that power? And so we slowly built out all the different little tools and things, and pulled some off the shelf, like Snapshot, for example, we used, and obviously Gnosis Safe, and a number of other components. But it was definitely a process that was iterative rather than us saying, okay, in a year's time, this is where we need to be. And, we're going to really think about like, what is that place and where do we want to be and go and build it. The fact that Compound was able to do that is kind of insane to me, right? Because like I make fun of projects all the time for trying to do that and failing miserably. And like the balance of probability says like Compound should not have been able to pull that off. And somehow they did. So it's a pretty impressive feat in my mind.
Thanks, Ken.
I was on mute. Okay. Interested in the point you made about how different current governance models are to synthetics and compounds, earlier ones. Where would you say kind of the new wave of like governance is going?
I mean, we are iterating closer to Compound, basically, right? Like we're iterating towards that where, we're getting to a point that a change is encoded in a contract, the contract is deployed, and then there is some sort of governance process that kind of ratifies that change, and then it's implemented on chain, right? Like it's a much more secure and safe way of kind of implementing changes. It's slower and it has trade-offs, but in terms of not needing to sort of cede power to some group of people that are administering a multi-sig that's making the changes and making a decision about which contracts are connected to, to what services or whatever, it's much, much safer because everyone can see it. It's transparent. You deploy the contract, you look at it, we all agree that is the contract, that's the change, and then we vote on just that specific thing. Again, direct democracy versus a representative democracy versus like some form of delegation, like there's flavors and nuances there, and I think we've gone much more towards like a very representative democracy rather than like a delegated democracy. But in terms of how we actually get the changes on chain, we're much closer to Compound now, and we're moving closer. We think it's a much better model.
Okay, because right now, and this kind of goes into the next question I wanted to ask, which is just getting into more details on how each of your governance models actually work. So for synthetics, is it that the final change is made via a multisig? Is that still the case?
Yep, okay. It's still the case. Yeah.
Right. And so what you're saying is that you want that model to transition into something that is made kind of more on chain?
Exactly. And our last 2 upgrades actually were done this way. It was still done by the protocol DAO, the multi-sig, but effectively there was a contract that was deployed. Everyone was able to review it before the protocol DAO, implemented the change. But in the future, it should be possible for us to effectively have someone deploy that contract as part of the SIP, the Synthetics Improvement Proposal process, and say, okay, this is the contract change. It's on chain now. You can inspect it. And then the council turns up and says, okay, we've inspected that change. We're comfortable with it. And then they vote on it. And then, it's implemented, rather than having some intermediary. And so I think that's the thing that Compound really got right. And I think it's a powerful approach and removes a lot of the kind of centralization and other risks that we have in other projects where there is a multi-sig that's implementing changes.
Wow, that's so interesting. So what will be the process for Synthetics to make that change? I imagine it has to go through another governance vote.
Interestingly, kind of, right? The change will have to be to give power to the Spartan Council to be able to execute a contract. So effectively what will need to happen is that right now there's a multi-sig. That multi-sig will need to transition to the Spartan Council, and they will have, at the moment, they have NFTs, which give them the power to vote. Those NFTs will give them the power to actually execute a transaction on chain. That will be kind of the next phase.
Oh, but okay. Wouldn't that just switch one centralized body to another one? What's the difference between a multi-sig and the Spartan Council?
Yeah, so the Spartan Council is voted in by people, and there are fairly strong checks on power within the Spartan Council. So token holders basically vote for a council member, but they also have the ability to to withdraw their voting power, right? And we've seen this happen a couple of times. So, for example, if I voted for you, you're on the council, and you do something which I believe is against my interest, I can actually, on that one specific thing, pull my voting power away from you, which dilutes your ability to vote. And so if let's say there was a contract that was, highly contentious that was deployed, and the Spartan Council votes on it, and, multiple people within the community are concerned about it, they would be able to withdraw their voting power, and that process would not be able to be executed. Whereas at the moment, the protocol DAO can just execute it. There's no check on their power. There's no way to stop them from executing something. They can just do it today with no oversight, really. The only oversight is that they've got some level of alignment because they're token holders, they've got a bond, there's some slashing, there's some other things, but it's nowhere near as powerful as having some direct execution mechanism like you have in the compound governance model.
Okay, that's interesting. And how many people are in the council?
There's 8 currently.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting. And okay, so for Compound, how does it feel like being kind of the gold standard of governance? That's pretty cool.
It's cool, but I think the best part about it is that we've built a process that I think is the safest and the most transparent and the most reusable by other teams. And I think the most gratifying part is actually seeing other teams getting to use the same code and not having to reinvent the wheel. A great example is I think the synthetic staking contract and the compound time lock are probably the most recycled contracts in DeFi. The best part is not that we got to use it, is that everyone got to use it. Because that's what moves the space as a whole forward the most, is being able to have a multiplicative power effect. And the system itself is actually extremely simple. I'll just describe it. There's basically a 2-day review period for a code change. There's a 3-day voting period for the code change, and a 2-day waiting period before it goes into effect if it's passed. And you're voting on very specific parameter changes or contract changes that are all executable code. So there's never instructions for a foundation change the logo on the website or please go out and do X, Y, or Z. It's the code has to be written ahead of time and then it gets voted on. So it's a very methodical process that requires you to have essentially completed all of the work. Ideally had it reviewed by the community and by peers. And it's a system that's coupled with the fact that anybody can bring code changes. They don't have to like get the sign off or approval of like a multi-sig or somebody first. And so this has actually enabled some really cool things. It enables the community to sort of create their own proposals. A great example is there's members of the community who work with Chainlink to add new assets to the price feed. That's a beautiful thing to watch. And you get to see, the whole system evolving and upgrading without, needing anyone's permission or sign off first. And so, if people have ideas that, they want to use a new, price feed or a new resource or a new, Chainlink, verifiable randomness function or a proof of, reserves of wrapped Bitcoin or some other feature, the community can actually, put forth proposals to implement new features. And so, it's a disciplined process combined with, it being open and permissionless that I think is really, really strong.
Very cool. And then like for the more like superficial, if you can call them that, changes like, okay, a logo on a website, that like all of those changes go, like there are, I guess, specific teams dedicated to all the other stuff that doesn't pertain to like parameters in the protocol, right?
Exactly. It's governance just over the protocol itself. So there's other off-chain components that aren't governed by the comp token. So, the website is still run by Compound Labs. The goal is to completely open source everything and let the community run it. And we'll just point to the best IPFS hash. And we're almost at that final step where, we've handed over complete control of the protocol itself. And now there's like some things that we're still building or working on that haven't been like fully turned over yet. But the goal is to get to the point where, even the website itself is run and owned by the community, and it might not go through the governance system, which is, it's on Ethereum, it's Solidity based, you're not, voting on code changes to a website, but if the community just, wants to maintain it on their own or run it on their own, they have that ability to.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. Okay. So it's been over a year for both of your protocols since you yielded control. What are the lessons so far? I know it's a hard one.
There's been lessons. So I think one of the lessons that we've learned is building an engaged community is invaluable, right? And Synthetics, I think, has had that for a very long time. We've had one of the most engaged communities in crypto. We've got one of the best Discords in crypto. If you don't have that, I think it would be a far harder task to kind of hand this control over, because who are you handing it over to? What are their incentives? Is the incentive alignment there? So I think before you can even contemplate handing over control, you need to have an engaged and aware community, right? Like you need to do that community building, which is then, an interesting question of, once you've done that and you've built this community and you've started to hand over power, where does the break point kind of sit between, for example, in Synthetics, we have core contributors who are paid full time to work on the protocol. They're paid by the DAO. So they're essentially paid by token holders to do that, but they have a purpose within the protocol. And one of the things that I think has come up for us this year is me having stepped back from kind of running the core contributors and helping to kind of dictate strategy and all kind of, a number of other aspects, that there are certain things that the community is probably not yet ready to take over. And certain functions that, either were not handed over well, or just maybe are hard to hand over. Like there might be some things that the community just can't do, right? And you actually need to appoint certain people to certain roles and ensure that those people are kind of maintaining those roles, right? So that's definitely something that I think that Synthetics has been dealing with. And one of the reasons why I came back and ran for the Spartan Council was to deal with some of the, the inefficiencies and friction that we've sort of seen in this process. But like everything Synthetics, it's iterative, right? Like we try something, I step back, things catch on fire, I come back, I put out the fires, and hopefully next time we're in a better place so the fires don't start, right? Like that's kind of the process that we're going through.
Nice. Kane, I love how you're kind of like just like so open about what's going on. It's really
yeah.
Okay, so
yeah.
So what are like those roles that you think are harder for a community to initially take on?
Most projects have a leader, right? Or like some figurehead or some person that like, the both the community and the broader crypto community sort of associate, right, with that project, right? Maker, it's Rune, right? Like if someone asks, like, I don't know if Maker is still run by Rune. Like, I don't know how much day-to-day control he has. But if you ask me, like, who is the person that I would look to be like, what is the purpose of Maker? It's Rune. I'm just gonna look there, right? It's Hayden with Uniswap. It's obviously Robert with Compound. But there's a big difference between being kind of the face of a protocol and controlling it, right? And being the dictator. That's, I think, the thing that all of us are kind of trying to work out in real time, right? Because we've never had a situation where, like Travis Kalanick just goes, hey, like I'm handing over control of Uber to the Uber drivers now. And like, see you later, like, and just what, like, no, like, that's not a thing, right? Like, like there's a CEO and that CEO runs the company, and there's no ambiguity there. Like there's zero ambiguity about like who is running, obviously there's a board and there's corporate oversight and all kinds of corporate governance stuff, but realistically, the CEO of a company runs the company. Everyone knows it. They're both the figurehead, the public facing person, and also the person who ultimately controls what happens, right? And when you remove that and you hand over control to this diffuse group of people, how do you ensure that, I think people do need to kind of have some anchor point or some person or whatever. And who is that? Now, we've seen in the cases, things like Yearn, right? Projects like Yearn, I think, have done a really good job where some community member has stepped up, like Banteg has stepped up, and people are now, well, it's him, them, a non-person, right? Rather than, say, Andre. Right. Like, and so like there are some examples of this going well, but it's a really hard process. And, I'm very curious to see how like even Robert thinks about this, because at some point, like Robert doesn't control Compound in the way that he did 2 years ago. Right. At what point do I stop caring what Robert thinks? Like, do I always have to care about what Robert, like I care about, his CryptoPunk views, right? But like, at what point do I stop listening to Robert about Compound? I don't know. Like maybe I always have to listen to him. Like, we really genuinely don't know how these things play out over longer time horizons.
Such an interesting discussion. I mean, Robert, what's your take there about project leadership and what place does it have in a decentralized world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think you're always going to have spiritual cheerleaders for a project, right? Myself included, Kane, like everybody. Like, if you founded something, even if you in a distant future don't have any financial stake in it, like you're still a big part of it. Like a great example is like Steve Jobs founded Apple and like only held on to a single share of Apple, right? But like still everyone knew that like Steve Jobs is someone that like was important, within the Apple construct, even if he had like no control at all over, what they did or how it worked. And so I think like over time, the founders of protocols become less important. Satoshi matters a lot less to Bitcoin today than he did, 10 years ago, he or she, right? And I think it's always a declining, path for the most part. But, I do think that like there is some relevance and it will decline. And I think that's a good thing, right? I think like it doesn't matter. Like no one 100 years later really remembers who founded, Ford and what he was like. They just know that there was a Henry Ford, and I think that protocols will be the same way, that in 100 years, people will be like, oh yeah, synthetics. Yeah, that awesome like protocol that took over, all synthetic and derivative assets. There was this guy named Kane, but like, who knows what he was like, and I think that's a really positive thing.
That's cool. I think maybe the job of the leader is to make sure that some kind of high level goal and vision is instilled very deeply in all of the contributors, team members, and people kind of bringing the company organization forward, so that that's kind of is what's passed on, and it doesn't matter. He can kind of still, they can be the face, but maybe it's the rest of the community kind of executing the vision that they set out to build. Okay, so this was a bit of a tangent, but a really interesting one. But back to the original question, Robert, I'm interested in your lessons from compound governance so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest lessons from compound governance so far is that, we designed a system that was, deliberately going to be a relatively slow process, because the value that we were trying to maximize was stability. When we talked about like what we wanted when we were designing all of this, we wanted, a system that wouldn't change every day. And I think we got that. I think it's possible that, we like vaguely overcorrected in, this stability, because, it's also a system that like, I sort of wish in retrospect would be a little bit more experimental. I think Synthetics is a, great example of like a community that's always been extremely experimental, like trying all sorts of things, all the time, seeing what works, throwing out the things that don't work, and adjusting and calibrating. And the compound, community governance process isn't as experimental. So if there's one thing I would change, going back, it might be like setting the initial parameters of governance, even for like, how long do you have to vote on things, to sort of infuse a little bit more experimental DNA into the process. But other than that, things have held up extremely well. Over the past year, we've seen a rate of governance proposals in which like the majority have come directly from the community, which was really cool to see. I, didn't expect there's going to be such a high ratio of proposals coming just directly from, developers, interested community members, VCs, alongside us. And so that's been a strong positive. And there's been about one proposal a week, on average since compound governance is launched. And so I've been impressed with the fact that just like it's been, generally not us, as Compound Labs, like driving any of these proposals forward.
It's funny, actually. I remember like in the early days, like first like couple of proposals or whatever, I was like, barriers to entry are too high here. Like no one's going to do this. Like, and you're like, no, like, people like they're working it out. And I was like, I'm very skeptical of like how many people are going to like go through the trouble of like understanding how to like write a contract that conforms to this thing. And I'm glad that I was wrong, but I do remember that conversation that we had, and you're like, no, it'll work. So.
Yeah. Well, that was a big experiment, just from us. Like we had to come up with a hypothesis and put it into motion and like, see if it works. And like, governance is a huge experiment that takes like years to play out. Like I actually think, one of the best governance communities is Maker. It has its own warts, but like in general, they've done a great job building like a governance community, and that's taken years, right? Like, and Synthetics has developed over years. It's also a great, community. So I actually think, the end state of what a governance system in a community looks like is measured maybe at like the 3-year mark, not the like 3-week mark of it going live.
And when you mean like governance community, it's like the people making the proposals, writing the changes, like executing this.
Yeah, it's everybody involved in, moving a protocol forward.
Yeah. I wonder, like, one thing about on-chain governance proposals and having something that's kind of very, very specific. It seems like it just limits the amount of people who can participate because it is so technical. I wonder if the governance, like tokenized governance, will evolve into a place where there are different roles, and maybe there's a role where there's just like a technical advisor who can kind of write proposals from non-technical members into code. I think maybe those kinds of new professions will start to emerge in Web3. I don't know. I'd like to see that from kind of someone who's not non-technical.
Absolutely. I mean, I think like, I think of like any corporation that exists today, like one day there might be like a decentralized version of it. Like, so, I use like Nike as an example. It's like, well, if Nike were like, a token run corporation, what would it look like? You wouldn't have everybody designing shoes, in the community. You might have some like ideas that come forth, but you probably wouldn't have people volunteering to do like material science. You'd probably have a couple experts, managing the material process. You probably wouldn't want, every customer to be weighing in on certain issues. And over time, you would specialize and figure out ways to specialize as a large decentralized community. So, I think like everyone votes on everything is probably, naive. And I think communities that succeed will figure out ways to move with like this open democratic foundation and build out specialized skills and tools and, experiences.
Right. And that kind of leads well into the next question, which is, I wanted to bring up this, I guess like one of the biggest criticisms with tokenized governance, which is that it creates this sort of a plutocracy where big token holders, project members with the most at stake in protocols have the biggest say. So I wanted your thoughts. Like, do you think this is an issue that needs to be fixed, or do you think that it's fair that large stakeholders have the biggest say in the protocols they're investing in?
Well, I'll start by saying that, you have the exact same behavior in every, public corporation in the world, where whoever has the most shares, gets to have the most control over the corporation, right? There's obviously, counterexamples where like some tech companies have founders that retain huge amounts of effective control through like dual class, like voting structures. But like in general, this is like the form of, corporate and, protocol governance that is in effect pretty much everywhere, where the more you own, the more say you have. And I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I also think it means that you have like the largest stakeholders motivated to see it succeed the most. The biggest disconnect will occur when you have the largest owners who put in the least amount of effort. I think that's something that's like a point of friction for decentralized communities, where people want to see the most ownership translate to the most effort. And, I think we'll see lots of different, conversations in crypto over the next couple of years with these sort of like friction points. But I don't think, the correlation between having largest stake and the largest say is a problem. And I think it's actually okay. And it's not something to combat.
I think this is one area where we definitely disagree. I think Compound is not in like by far not like problematic in this area, because I think the delegated component of Compound allows for people who maybe feel less confident in their ability to judge protocol changes to delegate to someone who they feel is going to vote similarly to how they would like to vote and kind of respect their views. But there is definitely a plutocratic element to it, right? Like there's no question, right? Particularly when it comes to, there's like a social plutocracy as well, right? Where like high profile people or VCs or whatever get a lot of delegation. And so there is a lot of control in a small number of hands in Compound. Now, I think the fact that Compound has constrained what is governable means that's not so much of an issue, right? Like it's real, like most of these things are fairly binary decisions, right? Like, is this risky or not risky, right? And so I think in most cases there is like general alignment in the protocol, but Synthetics has gone a very different way, and I think Synthetics has made a decision, not even intentionally, although we definitely never liked this idea of direct token voting. We did. There's always been a sort of social norm within Synthetics that like direct token voting, like Maker, just has like chilling effects and all kinds of problems that, cause people to drop out who might be like minority stakeholders and have different views. And so the fact that we didn't have an on-chain governance module for such a long time, like, Compound did, although we may have used the Compound governance module had it existed, right? So maybe I'm glad that it actually didn't exist back then. But, the fact that we had off-chain voting and this like, rough consensus process that played out in Discord for a really long time. When we went to kind of make that more on-chain, the initial parameters that were chosen, the minority revolted. Like we chose a structure that actually was much more plutocratic, and the minority said, whoa, we're not okay with this. Like we had a lot more power in the old regime, and we don't want you to take our power away. And so we then made changes, and we iterated, and we kind of moved closer to something that would significantly curtail the power of whales. So now the situation is, if you're a whale within Synthetics, there's 8 council members. You can get one person, maybe if you split it across a couple of wallets, maybe you can get 2 council members in, right? But you probably can't get 5. Right, which would be what you sort of need. And so what we have is this distribution where, I think in the last epoch, I got 35% of the votes. A lot of people just defaulted to like, sure, let this guy run the place again, fine. But then there's a long tail distribution of votes that happen. And you end up in a situation where, the marginal voter can really move the dial on like the 6th, 7th, and 8th seats, right? They do have a lot more power. And I think in general, that's allowed us to have something that kind of is a hybrid rough consensus with on-chain component in a way that most other protocols really haven't probably gotten right. I think there's a few protocols that have just gone to like a multi-sig, and the multi-sig people just make the decisions. But I do think that we've somehow just through a random walk like found ourselves in this position where we've like struck a balance between whales and community members, and one person, one vote, and $1 million worth of voting power, right? Like we've found a middle ground, and I think it's a pretty powerful place that we're in right now.
I agree.
So interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
I was gonna say I think it's awesome, and that like you guys have been able to find that and have been able to conduct like some social experiments to reach a middle ground, and I think that's like really empowering.
Yeah. I mean, we'll definitely continue seeing so many experiments in this area. Like there's quadratic voting. There's like Gitcoin did this airdrop where like a lot of voting power had to be delegated. I think Pull Together does something to limit the weight that individual token holders can have. So I mean, there's like probably one different governance system. There's as many governance systems as there are protocols. So we will kind of see which good models emerge from this. Interested to hear if there have ever been proposals that have gone against kind of what you wanted for your protocols.
I think I've voted against Robert before, if I remember correctly.
Contentious votes on Compound all the time.
Oh, cool. I think that's a great example of like this actually working. Like, yeah, if you can kind of expand on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the most contentious proposal we've had was around decreasing like the collateral factor for WBTC. It was like a huge asset on Compound. And, I was like extremely against decreasing the collateral factor because it was an incredibly important asset. And a lot of folks in the community wanted to see it decreased because they thought that, Compound was accumulating too much wrapped Bitcoin. Now, the irony is that we have a lot more today than we ever did back then. But, I thought it was going to be a disaster, and users would get liquidated because they wouldn't be paying attention. And it was an extremely contentious vote. I lost, collateral factor was reduced, there was only a couple users that got liquidated, we were able to let the news out and make sure people reduced their borrowing positions, but it was extremely contentious. It was an example of the community like really digging in over like a scientific parameter, which was really cool to witness, but I was definitely on the losing side.
Wow. How about you, Kane?
I mean, there's so many. There's a bunch. I think in the original proposal to change the inflation rate in monetary policy, I was really adamantly against it. We had this crazy Bitcoin halving like cliff thing that I thought was a great idea back in 2018 or whatever when we implemented it. And the community said, like, this is dumb. Like, there's no need to do this. Like, we have the mathematics to like create curves, right? Like, you don't need to have halvings. And so someone went out and they like, really aggressively like advocated it. And I was like, no, this is dumb. Like, we shouldn't do it. Like, we've changed it once. Like, I still had my Bitcoin maxi hat on back then, I guess, right? I hadn't fully let it go. Yeah, exactly. And they just kept pushing, and eventually got to a point where like there was a vote, and the vote was like very strongly in favor of like, this is a dumb thing, let's change it. And they did. And I was like, all right. But eventually I came around to the point where I was like, all right, actually, like, you are right. But it was a good example of like rough consensus and, building consensus within a community, rather than having some like centralized choke point that, some person that could say, no, we're not doing this, move on, right? Like, let's do, like a CEO would have said the first time that was brought up in a board meeting or whatever, like, hey guys, I see this problem, like, let's do it. Like, a bad CEO would have just been like, no, shut it down. Right. And then it doesn't happen. Yeah. Right. So it's a much better and more open process when, people can build consensus in the community and override, even strong voices, I guess.
Yeah. And then I guess that we need to be wrapping up, but that ties well with the last question I wanted to make, which is, this new model is just like so radically different than the old Web2 model, where founders retain majority stake on their companies, users have no say, and now we're going into Web3 where like the opposite is happening. Do you foresee like the next Facebook's, Google's, Bank of America's, like just huge global corporations? Will they be DAOs in the future?
No, they're not going to be DAOs in the future. And either they're going to die to the hand of DAOs, or they'll figure out a way to survive, but I don't see them adapting.
Yeah, agreed. I think they'll be wiped out by DAOs, but I don't think they'll turn into DAOs themselves.
So DAOs will be the next big global organizations of the future. I agree with you. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Protocols and DAOs.
Yeah.
Yes. This was amazing, guys. So thank you so much, and thank you, Chainlink, for having us.
Okay, let's go.
Emmy. Yeah.
Thanks, Emmy.
Thank you.
What a great panel. Thank you all so much for coming, bringing the white hair crew, punks, and Kimmy's as well as a women of blockchain. Rory, I'm going to bring you on with me. Rory's going to join me here, and we're going to do a sign off. That's day one. Rory, we did it.
Yeah, unbelievable, Andy. I just want to say what an incredible first day of the conference. Just to kind of do a quick summary, we had announcements regarding fully launching the Keepers Network to the public for DevOps services and off-chain computations, announcing the cross-chain interoperability protocol, CCIP, enabling a truly cross-chain set of smart contracts. We heard first thing in the morning about Swisscom joining the Chainlink network as a node operator. Celsius is now using Chainlink price fees to determining the borrowing rates. Again, they're controlling $16 billion at TVL. Also, they're part of the new CCIP implementation. And that's just kind of, I feel like, what happened in the first couple hours. But in addition to that, I just want to say we had some fantastic talks, including our last one with some of the most influential thought leaders in the space. And again, shout out. Obviously, this is day one, not the end of day three. But special shout out to our MCs, Andy, Dustin, Lauren, today, along with the rest of the team that kind of helped make everything put together. Those that don't know, this is about a 4-month process to basically put something like this together. So just as much as I'm excited to get through the first day, I know we have 2 more fantastic days, and I want to make sure they're amazing and we give people a great opportunity and a reason to really stop in. Andy, would love to know kind of, what your thoughts were.
I got to give one more shout out to the community, the viewers, people who are attending and watching and participating. I see people on Twitter. I see people in the chats. You guys supported Lauren on the other stage, her first time emceeing. We appreciate you. We really do. Your support of us and what we try to bring to you to bring you into the ecosystem as well with us. and kind of see all the cool stuff that's going on from the research side, from the enterprise side, from the DeFi side, from the DAO side. Now it's all over the board. So, and again, it's only day one. There's 2 more days of this. What else could come? Well, I guess we'll find out, Rory. I'll be here.
Absolutely. Yeah, just to let everybody know kind of what to expect for day 2. I think the real biggest difference is we have a full developer stage. So we'll have the innovation stage going on where you're going to see, traditional keynotes, panels, very similar discussions to what occurred today, but we'll have the developer stage a lot more interactive. You're going to hear from kind of the top sort of programs and software being used to build these kind of smart contracts, these new hybrid smart contracts. You're going to hear a lot from our developer evangelists and relations team as they basically take you through some really cool things. It's a great way if you're starting at 0, but you're interested. I think tomorrow will be a fantastic day for you to follow that dev track on the developer stage and just really go through the journey and probably at least at minimum understand some of the tools that you'll need to use to develop and maybe some of the tips and tricks that'll make you successful as you begin your journey. On the flip side, if you're an experienced developer, you're going to be hearing from the best developers in the space. So, I mean, these are people that are actually building the tools, that are actually coming up with the ideas and implementing these things. So I think there's something for you there as well. So again, I'm expecting a fantastic day 2. Andy, I believe you'll be joining us as well again to MC.
I'll be here all day tomorrow, all day Saturday. I'm ready, man. I'm hyped.
Absolutely. And so we'll do this. So again, 8 a.m. Eastern tomorrow is when we'll basically start with our innovation stage, our development.